Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in now, drawing the covers up and letting the long day finally loosen its grip on you, then you have come to the right place. Because tonight we are going somewhere very far away and very long ago, and we are going there slowly, with nothing asked of you at all, but that you lie still and let your mind drift where the story takes it. Tonight belongs to a woman, and to a city, and to a crown that came to rest on a head no one had quite expected it to rest upon. We are going to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in the years when it was young and golden and afraid, a thin strip of Christian land held by force at the far edge of the known earth. And we are going to follow one woman through the whole length of her life within it, from a child in a frontier town to a queen who governed the holiest city on earth in her own name. Her name was Melisende. She was the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, and the mother of a king, and yet the truest thing about her is that she was none of those things at the heart of it, but a sovereign in her own right. The first woman ever to hold real and open power in the Crusader East. Before her story closes, she will be crowned in glory, then quietly written out of her own kingdom by the very husband chosen to stand at her side, and then, in the strangest turn of all, shut up under siege in a tower in her own city by the son she herself had set upon the throne. But all of that lies a long way ahead of us, and we have the whole night to walk there together. Before we step across into her world, let me say one small word, and then I will not break the spell again. If these slow journeys back into the past are the kind of thing you would like to find your way to again on another sleepless night, you are very welcome to follow along, and to come back whenever rest is hard to come by. It costs you nothing, and it helps these old stories go on being told in the quiet. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you lie. Because I do love looking through the notes that people leave and picturing all of you out there in the dark, in so many different countries and so many different deeps of the night. All of us gathered for a little while around the same old tale. That is the whole of it. Now let yourself sink back down into the pillow, and we will begin. Picture this. It is the early part of the 12th century, and the place is a land that the people of Western Europe call, with a kind of awe in their voices, Outremer, which means simply the land beyond the sea. Only a handful of years before, in the closing summer of the century just gone, an army of Frankish knights had done a thing that the whole of Christendom had thought impossible. They had marched across half the earth, through hunger and plague and the high passes of Anatolia, and they had stormed the walls of Jerusalem itself and taken the holy city by the sword. The taking of the city had been a thing of terror and wonder both, the climax of 3 years of suffering on the long march east. And when the walls were breached at last, the victorious Crusaders had poured through the streets in a frenzy of slaughter that horrified even the age that bred it. Wading, the chroniclers said, through blood. Before they fell weeping to their knees at the tomb of Christ, they had crossed the world to free. Out of that violent and visionary triumph, the Crusader States had been born. Now their sons and their captains ruled a thin scatter of states, strung along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, clinging to the coast and the inland hills, hemmed about on every side by the great and ancient powers of the Muslim world, who had not forgotten what had been taken from them and meant, one day, to take it back. It was into this world, taut as a drawn bowstring, that the woman of our story was born, somewhere around the year 1105, not in Jerusalem at all, but far to the north, in the county of Edessa, the most exposed and dangerous of all the Frankish holdings, a Christian island set deep in a Muslim sea. It is worth letting that scene take shape around you for a moment, for it was unlike anything in the Europe the Crusaders had left behind. Imagine a strip of land running down the eastern edge of a warm and tideless sea, a country of pale limestone hills and dusty olive groves, of fierce white summers and short green springs, where the light came down hard and bright, off bare stone, and the air smelled of dust and time and the sea. The towns were old beyond the Franks' imagining, built and rebuilt by Romans and Greeks and Arabs long before any Western knight had set eyes on them, their narrow streets thick with a press of peoples that no European city could match. In the markets of these Crusader towns, a newcomer from Anjou or Lorraine would have heard half a dozen tongues at once: Frankish and Arabic and Greek and Armenian and the Syriac of the native Christians, and would have rubbed shoulders with veiled women and turbaned merchants and desert traders and pilgrims from every corner of Christendom. The conquerors were a thin, ruling crust laid over a vast and ancient population that was not theirs, Muslim and Eastern Christian and Jewish, and the Franks lived among them, always slightly as strangers in a land they ruled but did not fill. The villages of the countryside were worked, as they had been for ages, by Syrian and Arab peasants who paid their dues to new Frankish masters, but kept their own tongues and their own faiths and their own immemorial ways. And the lords who collected from them were, for all their castles, a tiny minority set over a populace who were not of their blood and did not love them. It was a settler society in the truest sense, a few thousand armed newcomers holding down a numerous and sophisticated land by force and by the careful handling of those they ruled, and its survival depended as much on that handling as on the sword. And the longer the Franks lived in it, the more it changed them. The grandsons of the fierce Crusaders who had stormed the walls were no longer quite the rough Westerners their forefathers had been. They had been born in the East and knew no other home, had learned to dress for the heat in the lighter garments of the country, to eat its food and use its baths and its physicians, to deal day by day with Muslim neighbours and Eastern Christian subjects, to live, in short, as people of the Levant rather than transplanted Europeans. Newcomers fresh from the West were often shocked by how thoroughly the settlers had gone native, how at ease they were in this foreign world. The houses of the great Frankish families came to be furnished with a comfort and a richness their grandfathers in cold northern keeps could never have dreamed of, with carpets and silk hangings and inlaid furniture, with fountains and shaded courtyards and the cool of stone against the heat, with the fruits and spices and sweet things of the East upon their tables and the famed physicians of Syria at their bedsides. A noblewoman of Melisende's rank lived in a world of fine textiles and worked metal and perfumed air that the courts of France would have envied, and she dressed, very likely, in the flowing garments of the country rather than the heavy wools of the West. It was a softer and more luxurious life than the crusading legend allows, and it was the life into which Melisende had been born. And yet the comfort never quite stilled the underlying fear, for the same household that dined on the sweet fruits of the East kept its arms close to hand and its ear always half-cocked for the alarm. Luxury and danger lay side by side in that world, the silk cushion and the ready sword, and the people who lived among them learned to hold both in mind at once. It was a hot, strange, beautiful, dangerous place, this Outremer, balanced forever on a knife's edge between glory and ruin, and it was the only home that Melisende would ever truly know. The shape of the country ran from the green hills of Galilee in the north down the high spine of ground that carried Jerusalem on its crest, and dropped away to the east into the deep rift of the Jordan, where the river wound down through reeds and heat to the strange flat brightness of the Dead Sea, that lake of bitter water lying lower than any other on the face of the earth. Beyond the settled hills and the coastal plain the desert began, the dry emptiness out of which raiders came and into which armies vanished. And the frontier was less a line on a map than a shifting band of peril where cultivation gave way to sand. Between sea and desert lay a narrow, fertile, fought-over ribbon of land, and every acre of it had been bled for. And even in the stretches that the chronicles call peace, the kingdom was never truly at rest, for between the great wars there ran a constant undercurrent of raid and skirmish and ambush, herds driven off and villages burned, and travellers cut down on the roads, the endless small violence of a contested frontier that never entirely ceased. A man might be a farmer in the morning and a corpse by evening. A caravan might vanish. A castle might wake to find an enemy column in the valley below. To live there was to live with danger as a constant companion, neither at war nor at peace, but somewhere always between the two. Beyond the last cultivated fields lay the desert and its people, the wandering tribes who moved with their flocks across the dry country and owed allegiance to no settled power, sometimes raiding the Frankish lands, sometimes guiding and guarding the caravans that crossed them. Always a presence to be reckoned with on the kingdom's open eastern flank. The trade of half a world moved along those desert roads, the spices and silks and the pilgrims bound for the holy places, and the wealth of the kingdom depended on keeping the routes open and the tribes more friendly than hostile. A thing achieved by a careful mixture of payment and force and patient negotiation. And it was a world held by the narrowest of margins. The kingdom and its sister states were always short of the one thing they needed most, which was fighting men. For the knights who held the land were few, and the enemies around it were many. And every year, a fresh trickle of pilgrims and adventurers from the west was barely enough to replace those who fell. A single lost battle could open the whole country to ruin. A single year of bad harvests, or a single great enemy gathering his strength, could put everything in doubt, and they were terribly far from home. A message sent to the west, a plea for help or news of a disaster, might take many weeks or even months to cross the sea and the length of Europe, and an answer as long to return, so that the kingdom often had to meet its crises alone, with whatever strength lay to hand, long before any aid could come. The settlers of Outremer lived at the very end of the Christian world, a small and distant people, clinging to the holy places, sustained by a thin and uncertain lifeline of ships and pilgrims and the slow, irregular arrival of help from a homeland most of them had never seen. The Franks lived, generation after generation, with the knowledge that their hold on the holy places was a thing maintained by constant effort and constant blood, and that it could be lost. Children of that world grew up understanding it in their bones, and Melisende was such a child. The shadow of that knowledge lay over everything, and it shaped the people the kingdom produced, hard and devout and watchful, and few of them harder or more watchful than the woman of our story. She learned, before she could have put it into words, that survival was never to be taken for granted, that strength lay in unity and weakness in division, and that a kingdom was a fragile thing that careless hands could break. Her father was a man named Baldwin, called Baldwin of Bourke, a younger son of a French noble house who had come east with the Great Crusade as a poor and landless knight and had risen, through hard fighting and harder luck, to become the Count of Edessa. He was lean and pious and careful with money, a soldier first and always, with a long face and a longer patience, and he had done something that marked him out from most of the conquering Franks around him. He had married into the land he had come to rule. His wife, and the mother of our queen, was a woman named Morphia, the daughter of an Armenian warlord named Gabriel, who held the city of Melitene in the north, and she was not a Frank at all. She was Armenian by blood and Eastern Christian by faith, a woman of the old settled Christianity of those lands, and her marriage to Baldwin had begun, like so many marriages of that age, as a matter of alliance and a chest of useful silver. What is striking is what it became. For Baldwin, who would in time be offered every chance to set Morphia aside for a grander and more political match, refused each time to do it. He kept her, and he loved her. By every sign we have, and the 4 children she gave him were all daughters, and he loved them too, and built his whole later life around securing their future. In an age when a wife who gave a ruler no son was a wife easily discarded, that steadiness tells you something quiet and real about the man. and about the household that shaped the child who would become a queen. Edessa, where Melisende drew her first breaths, was the very sharpest point of the whole Crusader venture, the most exposed of all the Frankish lands, a Christian county thrust far out beyond the Euphrates into a sea of Muslim and Armenian territory, with no friendly coast at its back and enemies on every side. To hold Edessa was to live always with one ear cocked for the alarm bell, to know that a raiding column might appear on the horizon at any season, that the roads were never wholly safe, that the city walls were the thin line between order and catastrophe. It was a hard place to be a child, and a harder one to be a count. And the man who held it had to be tough and watchful and lucky all at once. The seasons themselves were a kind of clock of danger, for the warriors of both faiths rode and fought in the dry months of summer and autumn when the roads were passable and the campaigns could be waged, and drew back in the wet cold of winter, so that the year turned in a rhythm of fighting and waiting, of harvest gathered under guard and walls, watched through the long, bright, dangerous days. That Melisende's father held it for years and rose from it to a crown tells us what kind of man he was, and that he chose to root himself in the land by marriage to a daughter of the country, rather than holding himself aloof as a conqueror among the conquered, tells us something rarer still. A willingness to belong to the East rather than merely to rule it. For Morphia was no mere political convenience to be used and set aside. The chroniclers, who rarely waste ink on the wives of kings, found room to note that Baldwin loved her and kept her against all advice. And the long devotion of that marriage shines through even the dry record of charters and grants. She brought him the friendship of her father's Armenian world, a network of alliance and information that would prove its worth in the kingdom's darkest hour. She brought him, too, a household that was genuinely double, Latin and Armenian, Western and Eastern, and into that household her 4 daughters were born. We should picture Melisende's earliest years not in some grim crusader barracks, but in a warm and crowded great house, full of the sounds and smells of 2 cultures, the Latin prayers of her father's chaplains and the older liturgies of her mother's faith, the food of East and West, the languages braided together, the comings and goings of Frankish knights and Armenian lords and Syrian servants. And it was a crowded and a close one. 4 little girls growing up together in the dangerous frontier years, sharing the same rooms and the same lessons and the same fears, bound to one another by ties that the long and scattering decades to come would stretch across half the Crusader world, but never quite break. The bond formed in that shared childhood would matter more than any of them could have guessed, for it would be 2 of those same sisters who would sit by Melisende's bed at the very end, when all the crowns and the conflicts were finished, and only the blood remained. It was an unusual nursery for a queen, and it made an unusual queen. So Melisende grew up the eldest of 4 sisters, in a world that was double from her very first breath. On one side stood her father's people, the Franks, the newcomers, the hard-handed Western knights with their Latin mass and their crusading zeal and their memories of green Anjou and grey Normandy far away. On the other side stood her mother's people, the Armenians and the Eastern Christians, older in the land than the Franks could imagine, with their own ancient liturgies and their own deep roots in the soil of Syria. Melisende was made of both. She would have heard the tongues of East and West mingled around her from infancy, would have known the incense of the Eastern rite and the chant of the Latin one, would have grown up understanding in her very bones that the land was not made of one kind of Christian people, but of many layered together and rubbing against one another in the narrow streets of the Crusader towns. That doubleness was not a weakness in her. It would prove, in the long run, to be one of the great sources of her strength, for she belonged wholly to neither camp and could speak, when she had to both. And she carried within her, all her life, the example of the mother who had been the living bridge between those worlds. The Armenian queen who had freed a captive king and held a kingdom together by the strength of her own connections and her own nerve. Whatever Melisende became, she became it partly in that image, the daughter of a woman who had shown her, before she was old enough to understand it, that a queen need not be a passive ornament at a king's side, but could be a force in her own right. And beyond her mother's Armenian world lay a greater power still, the ancient Christian empire of the Greeks at Constantinople, heir to the Romans and the mightiest of all Christian states, whose emperors looked on the upstart Crusader princes with a wary and condescending eye, and whose friendship or enmity could weigh heavily in the affairs of the East. The Frankish states lived always in the shadow of that empire, now its allies and now its rivals, and the Eastern and Greek strands in Melisende's own blood gave her, however faintly, a foothold in that wider world as well. Her mother's people, too, were no small presence in the Holy Land, for the Armenians were an ancient Christian nation with their own church and their own script and their own long history in those lands. And they had a quarter of their own within the walls of Jerusalem. To them, the half-Armenian queen was a natural friend and protector, and in her they had something they had never had before and would never have again, a sovereign of their own blood upon the throne of the holy city. Of her actual childhood, we know almost nothing, as is so often the way with medieval women, even queens. The chroniclers of that age wrote down the deeds of fighting men and let the early years of everyone else fall silent. But we can build the shape of it from what surrounded her. She would have been raised partly in the saddle and partly in the women's quarters, taught her letters and her psalter and the management of a great household, taught above all the iron arithmetic of the Crusader world, which was that this Christian kingdom lived always one lost battle away from destruction, that its strength lay in its unity, and that the death of a ruler with no clear heir could undo in a season everything that a generation of bloodshed had built. She would have grown up with several tongues in her ears, the Frankish French of her father's court and the Armenian of her mother's kin. Very likely the Latin of the church and scraps of the Arabic and Greek that filled the streets of the Crusader towns. A child equally at home in several worlds and belonging entirely to none of them. And she would have been taught, too, the practical arts of a great lady of that age, the running of a vast household, the keeping of accounts, the management of servants and stores, and the endless business of a noble establishment. For a queen was the mistress of a household that was itself a kind of small kingdom. She would have learned to sit in company with her father's counsellors, and to hold her tongue and use her eyes to read the moods of powerful men, to understand the webs of loyalty and grievance and ambition that bound the great families of the land together and set them at each other's throats. She was a child of the frontier, and the frontier teaches early. And then, when she was still young, the ground beneath her family shifted, and the daughter of a frontier count found herself, almost overnight, the daughter of the King of Jerusalem. It happened because of a death far to the south. In the spring of the year 1118, the first King of Jerusalem, another Baldwin, died without children of his body to follow him, and the crown of the holy city fell vacant. The great men of the kingdom, the barons and the bishops, looked about them for a strong hand to take it up, and their eyes settled on Baldwin of Bourg, the Count of Edessa, who was a cousin of the dead king and a proven soldier, and a man the kingdom could trust. It was an astonishing turn of fortune for the family, the kind of leap that the Crusader world, young and fluid and made by the sword, still occasionally allowed. A man who had come east with nothing but his horse and his arms and his courage, a younger son with no prospect of greatness in the crowded hierarchies of France, had risen first to rule a county, and now to wear the crown of the holiest kingdom on earth. And his daughters rose with him. The girls who had been the children of a frontier count, important enough in their own corner of the world, but hardly figures of the first rank, were now the daughters of a king, princesses of Jerusalem. Their marriages suddenly matters of high European politics, their futures bound up with the fate of the holy places themselves. He was chosen, and he came south, and so Melisende's father became Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, and her quiet northern girlhood ended. The family did not move all at once, for the north still needed holding, but in time, Morphia and her daughters made the long road down to the holy city. Picture that journey, the queen and her 4 young daughters travelling the length of the Crusader lands from the far northern frontier down to Jerusalem in the south, a progress of many days through a country of bare hills and walled towns and watchful garrisons, an armed escort about them, the dust of the road on everything, the strangeness of leaving the only home the girls had known for a city they had heard of all their lives as the holiest place on earth. For Melisende, a girl of 10 or 12, it would have been the great adventure of her childhood, the road that carried her out of the frontier county of her birth and toward the throne that waited, though she could not have known it. And there, at the close of the year 1119, the new king was at last crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, over the very tomb where Christians believed their Lord had been laid and had risen again. And here we come to one of the small telling acts that reveal the man at the centre of this family, and the values that Melisende drank in with the air she breathed. Baldwin did not rush to his crowning. He waited. He held off his own coronation for many long months, putting off the highest honour the kingdom could give him, and he did it for one reason only, which was so that Morphia and their daughters could make the journey south, in time to be crowned alongside him. He would not be raised up without them. When the day came at last, in the deep of winter, Morphia, the Armenian merchant's granddaughter, was crowned Queen of Jerusalem at her husband's side, and the 4 girls stood with their parents in the candlelit dark of the holiest church in the world. Melisende was perhaps 10 or 12 years old. She would have understood little of the politics, and felt all of the weight, the gold, and the incense, and the chanting, and the sense pressing down on a child's shoulders. That her family now stood at the very centre of the Christian world. Try to stand in that church with her for a moment, for it is worth seeing. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was, to the medieval Christian, quite simply the most sacred place that existed anywhere on the earth, the spot where the faith itself had been born out of death, and to be crowned there was to be raised up in the very presence of God. Imagine the dim and ancient interior, heavy with the smoke of countless candles and the blue drift of incense, the gold of the lamps and the vestments catching the small flames, the deep voices of the clergy rising and falling in the chant, the press of the great men of the kingdom in their finest robes, the whole weight of stone and history and holiness bearing down upon the little family from the frontier who now stood at the heart of it all. Imagine, too, the holy city by night, as it lay about that candlelit church, while the rite went forward within, the narrow streets dark and silent under the stars, the watch pacing the walls, the great dome a deeper shadow against the sky, the whole sleeping city wrapped in the deep quiet of the eastern night, holding within its compass the most sacred places of the faith, and now, on this night, a newly crowned royal house. A child of 10 or 12, standing in that golden shadow, watching her mother bow her head to receive the crown of Jerusalem, would not have grasped the politics of succession or the careful calculations of her father. But she would have felt, with the whole of her small body, the enormous gravity of the thing. The sense that her family had been lifted up to a height from which there could be no ordinary falling, and that the crowns and the candles and the chanting were somehow about her too, about all of them, about a destiny that had reached out and gathered the daughters of Edessa into itself. Children remember such moments all their lives. Melisende would have carried that one to her grave. She could not have known it yet, but the crown that was set that day upon her mother's head would one day be set upon her own. If the crowning gave Melisende her first lesson in the weight of power, it was her mother who gave her the deeper one, the lesson in what a woman could actually do with it. For a few years after the coronation, the realm held steady, and then, in the year 1123, disaster struck at the very top of it. King Baldwin, campaigning in the north as he so often did, was ambushed and taken prisoner by a Muslim lord, carried off into captivity in a distant fortress and held there for ransom. A medieval kingdom without its king was a body without a head, and a captured king was worse than a dead one, for he could neither rule nor be cleanly replaced, only bargained over while his enemies gathered their nerve. And in that long and dangerous season, with her husband shut up in a stronghold far away, it was Morphia who acted. We should not pass too quickly over what that meant, for it was an extraordinary thing for a woman of that age to do. A queen whose husband had been carried off into enemy hands was, by every ordinary expectation, a figure of helpless grief, a woman to be pitied and protected and married off again if the worst came to pass. She was not expected to act. She was expected to wait and to weep and to let the men of the kingdom manage the crisis as best they could. Morphia did not wait. She understood, with the cold practicality that marked the women of her line, that her husband's freedom would not fall from heaven and would not be won by tears, that it would have to be bought and schemed and worked for, and that she possessed tools for the work that no Frankish baron could match. She was of the country. She spoke its languages and knew its people, and could reach into the Armenian world that lay all around the place of her husband's captivity in a way that the Western lords, for all their swords, simply could not. And so she went to work quietly and relentlessly, spending her money and her connections, and at last her own child, until the thing was done, and the king came home. She did not wait helplessly for the great men to settle it among themselves. She used the one thing she had that the Frankish barons did not, which was her own people and her own country. She was Armenian, and the lands where her husband was held were threaded through with Armenians, and Morphia reached into that world and put it to work. By the accounts that have come down to us, she paid a band of Armenian soldiers to slip into the very garrison that held the king, to get close to him and prepare the ground for his freedom. She did not merely send her agents and her money. She went herself, by the accounts that survive, travelling up into Syria, into the very borderlands of the enemy, to press the negotiation in person, a queen carrying her husband's freedom on her own shoulders into dangerous country. And when at last a bargain was struck for his release, a bargain that demanded both silver and a hostage to guarantee the rest of the payment, it was Morphia who gave up the surety the enemy required. She handed over her own youngest daughter, the little Ioveta, Melisende's baby sister, to be held by her father's captors until the last of the ransom was paid. It is a thing that stops the breath a little, even now, across all the centuries. A queen who freed a king by spending her own child as a pledge, and then, having freed him, set about getting that child safely back. Melisende was a young woman by now, old enough to watch all of this happen, and to understand exactly what she was seeing. She was watching her mother hold a kingdom together by nerve and cunning and connection, while the men were absent or imprisoned. She was watching a woman move armies of money and loyalty across a frontier, negotiate with the kingdom's deadliest enemies, and pay the most terrible price a mother can pay, all without ever once sitting on a throne or carrying a sword. The example of it must have sunk into her like dye into wool. When her own time came, decades later, to defend her power and her place, by every means short of the battlefield, she would draw, whether she knew it or not, on the memory of a mother who had shown her that a woman's hands, if they were steady enough, could hold up the whole weight of a kingdom. Morphia did not live to see her daughter crowned. We do not know the manner of her passing, only that it came while her eldest daughter was still a young woman, not yet settled in marriage, and that the king who had loved her and kept her against all the worldly advice of his counsellors now had to face the hardest stretch of his reign without the partner who had freed him from captivity. She died, most likely, in the year 1127, while Melisende was still young, and she was laid to rest in the Abbey Church of St. Mary in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, in the green hollow below the city walls, where the faithful believed the Mother of God herself was buried. It is worth holding that place in your mind, that quiet valley church, for our story will return to it at the very end. With Morphia gone, and with no son ever born to follow him, King Baldwin faced the hardest question a medieval ruler could face, which was the question of who would come after him. He had 4 daughters and no boys, and the kingdom he had spent his life defending could not simply pass to a girl as a farm might pass to a daughter, for a kingdom needed a war leader at its head, a man who could put on armour and ride out before the host. And yet Baldwin had no intention of letting his blood and his crown slip away to some distant cousin or ambitious baron. He made a decision that was, for its age, quietly radical. He chose his eldest daughter. He named Melisende his heir. He did it carefully, in the way a careful man does everything. He did not simply announce it and hope. He worked to build the ground beneath her, year by year, so that when the time came, the realm would be ready to accept her. He began to associate her with the business of rule while he still lived, drawing her name into the great acts of his reign, so that the barons would grow used to seeing it there. A grant of land to the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most solemn documents the Chancery produced, was made in her name, marking her out before the whole church as the one who would inherit. Words mattered enormously in that world of parchment and ceremony, and a title carefully chosen and endlessly repeated was a kind of slow construction, building in the minds of all who heard it the settled assumption of a thing not yet come to pass. Every time a clerk wrote that phrase, every time it was read aloud in the hearing of the barons, the idea of Melisende as the coming ruler grew a little more solid, a little more inevitable, until it was simply how the realm thought of her. And in due course her authority would take physical form in the apparatus of rule itself, in the great seal pressed into the wax that closed and authenticated her acts, in the charters that went out under her name, in all the small solemn machinery by which a medieval ruler made her will into law. These were not empty forms. In a world where most could not read, the seal and the ceremony and the witness grant were the very substance of power, the visible signs that the holder was truly sovereign, and Melisende wielded them as fully as any king before her. She was styled, in the formal language of the court, as the daughter of the king and the heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem, and that phrase was not idle flattery, but a deliberate act of state, repeated and reinforced until it hardened into expectation. For in that age, a ruler was not made by blood alone, but by the assent of the realm, by the solemn oaths of the great men who held its lands and led its knights. And a claim unsupported by those oaths was a claim built on sand. So Baldwin gathered the barons and the bishops, and had them acknowledge his daughter, binding them by their word to accept her when his time came, weaving her right into the very constitution of the state. And he secured for her the backing of the High Court, the great assembly of barons and bishops, whose consent gave a ruler legitimacy, so that her claim would rest not on his word alone, but on the sworn agreement of the men who mattered. Melisende, in other words, was not stumbling into power. She was being prepared for it, openly and on purpose, raised up to be a queen who would rule and not merely a daughter who would be handed off in marriage. We are so used, looking back to the idea of queens, that it is easy to miss how strange and bold this decision really was. In the Europe of that age, a woman might rule as a regent for a young son, holding power in trust until a boy grew old enough to take it. She might wield great influence as the wife or mother of a king. She might, in rare and contested cases, pass a claim to the throne down through her body to a son. But for a woman to be named, openly and deliberately, as the heir who would herself reign, the sovereign in her own person, was something close to unheard of, and it cut against the deepest assumptions of a world that took it for granted that ruling, and above all, the war leading that ruling required, was the business of men. Far away in the West, in those very years, the King of England was wrestling with the same problem and trying to force his own barons to accept his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as his heir. And that attempt would end in nearly 20 years of ruinous civil war when the barons broke their word and refused a woman's rule. Baldwin of Jerusalem was attempting the same difficult thing on the eastern edge of the world, and he was attempting it more carefully, and in the end, more successfully. He did not merely name Melisende in hope. He spent years building the acceptance of it into the very fabric of the kingdom, so that when his death came, the thing would already be settled in the minds of the men who mattered. It was patient, far-sighted statecraft, and it gave his daughter a foundation that her Western counterpart was never granted. But there was a catch, and Baldwin knew it better than anyone, and it would cast a long shadow over the whole of his daughter's life. A Queen of Jerusalem could not rule entirely alone, not in that world and that war. She would need a husband, and not just any husband, but a man strong enough to lead the kingdom's armies in the field, to be the sword that the crown required. And the choosing of that man was the most dangerous decision of all. For whoever Baldwin picked to stand beside his daughter would hold enormous power, and the whole delicate question of her reign would turn on whether that man could be trusted to share the crown with her rather than to seize it for himself. Baldwin had built his daughter a path to the throne. Now he had to find her a husband who would walk beside her on it and not push her off. It is worth noting that Melisende had remained unwed unusually late by the custom of her age, well into her 20s, when most noble women were married off as girls, and the delay tells us something. So long as her father might yet, against the lengthening odds, father a son of his own, her own position as heir hung in the balance, and a hasty marriage might either tie her to a man unworthy of a future queen or saddle the kingdom with a consort it had no use for. So Baldwin waited and weighed, and only when the hope of a son was truly gone did he turn in earnest to the great question of his daughter's husband. He looked west for the answer, back across the sea to the old Frankish homelands, for the kingdom needed fresh blood and fresh swords from Europe, and a marriage to a great Western lord would bring both. He sent envoys to the King of France, Louis VI, and asked him to recommend a man worthy of the Holy City's heir, and the name that came back was Fulk, the Count of Anjou and Maine, one of the richest and most powerful nobles in all of France. On paper he was close to perfect. He was a seasoned soldier and a shrewd ruler of his own broad lands. He was deeply pious, and he already knew the East, for he had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem some years before, and had even fought for a season alongside the Knights of the Temple. So he came not as a stranger to the Crusader world, but as a man who had already given it his sword. He was wealthy enough to bring real resources to a kingdom that was always short of them. And he was available, for his first wife had died, leaving him a widower with grown children of his own, including a son named Geoffrey who, in one of those threads that bind the whole medieval world together, would marry the Empress Matilda of England and become the father of a line of English kings. There was, however, one detail in the match that mattered more than the chroniclers of the time troubled to dwell on, and that would shape everything that followed. Fulk was a great deal older than Melisende, by something close to a generation, a settled and forceful man in his middle years who had spent his whole life as a sovereign lord in his own right, accustomed to being obeyed and answerable to no one. And he was not coming east to be a queen's consort, a sword carried at her side. Whatever the agreement said on parchment, Fulk of Anjou was coming to be a king. He gave up his great county in France, handing Anjou over to that son Geoffrey, and he came to Jerusalem to marry the heir of the Holy Kingdom. And in the year 1129, the wedding was held, and the older Western count and the young Eastern princess were joined. Picture the man who stepped off the ship onto the quay at one of the kingdom's ports to claim his bride and, in time, his crown. Fulk of Anjou was no green youth dazzled by the Holy Land. He was a hardened and successful prince in his middle years, a man who had governed broad and turbulent territories in France, fought his wars, buried a wife, raised grown children, and learned in a long life of command to trust his own judgment above all others. He came east trailing wealth and followers and reputation, a great Western lord who had given up one of the richest counties in France for the promise of a kingdom, and he did not come humbly. To a man like that, the arrangement that he should share the crown with a young woman barely out of girlhood, however royal her blood, can only have seemed a formality, a courtesy to the memory of her father, a thing to be honoured in word and quietly set aside in deed. The chronicler who knew the court has left us a sketch of him that helps us see the man, a ruddy-faced soldier, likened to the biblical David, faithful and kind and gentle in his dealings, an experienced and patient commander, well liked by those who served him, marred by one curious failing, a memory so poor for faces and names that he could not always recognize even the men who served him daily. It is an oddly human detail to set beside the iron-willed king who tried to swallow his wife's crown, a reminder that he was a real and complicated person and not a mere villain in her story. He had ruled alone all his life. He surely expected to go on ruling alone, and for a little while, with the old king still living and the bride still young and untried, it must have seemed to everyone, perhaps even to Melisende herself, that this was simply how it would be. The whole drama of the years to come lay coiled inside that quiet, mistaken assumption, waiting. For the first years of the marriage were calm ones, and there is no sign that anyone foresaw the storm to come. The old king still lived and reigned, and so long as he did, the question of who would rule after him remained safely in the future, and Fulk had no reason yet to grasp at a power that was not his to take. Melisende bore her husband a son within the first year, the little Baldwin, who secured the succession into a third generation, and to all appearances the great design was working exactly as her father had planned. The Western lord and the Eastern heir joined. An infant prince in the cradle, the future of the kingdom assured. For a little while, with old King Baldwin still alive to hold the balance between them, it all seemed well. But the seed of the first great struggle of Melisende's life had just been planted, and it would not be long in growing. For 2 more years the old king lived on, and while he lived the peace held. For Baldwin was the one man whose authority both his daughter and his son-in-law accepted without question. But Baldwin was aging and worn, and in the late summer of the year 1131 he fell mortally ill. Feeling death close upon him, he did a thing that tells us he could see the danger ahead as clearly as we can. He did not leave the succession to chance or to the strength of the strongest man in the room. From his sickbed, he formally conferred the kingdom not on Fulk alone and not on Melisende alone, but on the 3 of them together, on Melisende and on Fulk, and on their infant son, the little Baldwin, who had been born the year before. The crown was to belong to all 3 as one. He had seen, perhaps, with a dying man's clarity, the very danger that would come to pass, that a strong and willful husband might try to shoulder his daughter aside. And he did what little a man on his deathbed could do to guard against it, writing her right and her son's right into the foundation of the grant itself, so that Fulk would hold the crown, not in his own sole person, but as one of 3, bound to a wife and a child, who shared it with him by the express will of the king who gave it. It was the old king's last and most deliberate act of statecraft, a careful binding of his daughter's right into the very grant of the kingdom, so that no one could later pretend she had been merely the vessel through which power passed to her husband. He had reigned for some 13 years over the holy city, and before that had held the dangerous county in the north for as long again, a lifetime of hard soldiering and careful kingship that had carried him from obscurity to the summit of the crusading world. Then Baldwin II, who had come east a landless younger son and risen to rule the holiest city in the world, laid down his life and was buried near the place of the crucifixion in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, among the kings. It is worth pausing at this deathbed, for it is the hinge on which Melisende's whole life turns. Everything her father had built pointed at this moment. The moment when the careful preparation of years would either hold or fail. A medieval succession was never truly safe until it had actually happened, until the new ruler was crowned and obeyed, and the dangerous gap between one reign and the next had been bridged without a strong man seizing his chance in the confusion. Baldwin had done everything a father and a king could do to bridge that gap for his daughter. He had named her and styled her and woven her into the charters and won the oaths of the barons and married her to a powerful protector, and now, at the very end, he bound her right into the grant of the kingdom itself, so that no one could afterward pretend she had been left out. He died, having given her every advantage that foresight could give. And yet, as the event would show, even all of that was not quite enough to guarantee her the substance of the power, only the form of it. For the man he had chosen to protect her claim would turn out to be the very man most determined to swallow it. The old king closed his eyes, believing, perhaps, that he had secured his daughter's future. He had secured her a long and bitter fight. A few weeks later, in the early autumn of that same year, Melisende and Fulk were crowned together as Queen and King of Jerusalem in the same great church, over the same holy ground. It was done on a day heavy with meaning, the autumn feast that honoured the Holy Cross itself, the most fitting of all days on which to raise up the rulers of the city where that cross had stood, and the whole kingdom gathered to see it. For Melisende, it must have been a moment of strange doubled feeling, grief for the father just buried in that very church, mingling with the fulfilment of everything he had raised her toward. For a crowning was not merely a ceremony, but a sacrament, a sacred raising up in which the ruler was anointed with holy oil and set apart from ordinary mortals, marked as God's own chosen instrument for the governing of the realm. To be crowned and anointed in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, above the very tomb of Christ, was to receive that sacred character in the most charged spot on earth. And it gave to Melisende's queenship a holiness that no later quarrel could quite strip away, for an anointed sovereign could not simply be unmade. She knelt where her mother had knelt a dozen years before, in the same gold and candle smoke, and rose a crowned Queen of Jerusalem, sovereign by blood and by right over the holiest ground in the world. She was, by every law and oath and sacred sign of her people, the rightful ruler of the kingdom. What she did not yet know, kneeling there, was how little the laws and the oaths and the signs would weigh against the simple, stubborn will of the man kneeling beside her. It was a coronation marked, the chroniclers tell us, by a strange and telling gift for the Muslim ruler of Egypt, hearing of the new king, sent to the court a precious object carved of ivory. A gesture of recognition from one of the kingdom's great neighbours and enemies. A reminder even in that Christian hour of the wider and stranger world in which the holy city sat, ringed by powers that watched its every change of ruler with calculating eyes. And for a brief while, it might have seemed that the careful design would hold. But Fulk had not crossed the world and given up a great French county to be the lesser half of a partnership. He had been a sovereign all his life, and he meant to be one here. And so, almost as soon as the old king was safely in his grave, the new king began, quietly and steadily, to push his wife to the edges of her own kingdom. And the realm whose edges she was pushed toward was at its heart the city of Jerusalem itself. So let us hold that city in our minds, for it was the prize over which all these struggles were fought. It was not a large place by the measure of the great cities of the East, a compact town of pale stone crowded onto its hills, ringed by ancient walls, baked by the sun, but it was the most charged ground on earth. Every street and corner of it heavy with sacred meaning. The city was a patchwork of quarters and peoples laid one against another within the single ring of its walls, the Franks and the native Christians of a dozen rites, the Syrians and the Greeks and the Armenians of her mother's faith, each with their churches and their streets, the whole crowded compass of it, threaded with narrow lanes and covered markets. The days marked out by the ringing of church bells and the chanting of 100 liturgies in as many tongues. Within its walls rose the great church over the Holy Tomb, and the broad platform where the Temple of Solomon had once stood. Crowned now by the golden dome, the Franks had turned into a Christian shrine. Pilgrims were the lifeblood of the holy city and the whole purpose, in a sense, of the Crusader enterprise. For the realm existed above all to keep the sacred places open and safe for the faithful who came to them. They had crossed the perilous sea and the bandit-haunted roads at the risk of their lives, sold their goods and left their homes, many of them never to return, all for the sake of kneeling at the tomb of Christ and walking the way of his passion through the streets of the city. The voyage alone was a trial that swallowed many of them whole, weeks crammed aboard a wallowing ship at the mercy of storm and pirate and disease. The crossing made only in the sailing season, when the seas were thought safe enough to attempt. So that the rhythm of life in the Holy Land beat to the coming and going of the pilgrim fleets, swelling with newcomers in the season of arrivals and thinning again when the ships had carried the survivors home. To watch them arrive, ragged and exhausted, and overcome with a joy that often broke into open weeping at their first sight of the walls, was to understand what the whole struggle was for. The land itself was richer than the bare hills suggested, terraced and tended over the centuries into groves of olive and fig, vineyards heavy on the slopes, fields of wheat and barley in the valleys, orchards of almond and date, and the precious cane from which sugar was pressed. A luxury almost unknown in the West, that the settlers learned to grow and to sell at a handsome profit. The country fed itself and more, and what it could not eat, it traded. Much of that wealth flowed in through the harbours of the coast, where the merchant cities of Italy, Venice and Genoa and Pisa had won themselves quarters and privileges in return for the ships and the sea power on which the realm utterly depended, for it was their fleets that carried the pilgrims east and the trade of the Orient west. The silks and spices and sugar of Asia passing through the Crusader ports to the markets of Europe and filling the royal treasury with the customs duties that paid for its defence. The holy city sat astride one of the busy trade roads of the east, and grew rich upon it. Its narrow streets were a babel of merchants and monks and soldiers and beggars. Its markets fragrant with spices and crowded with the goods of 3 continents, its air ringing with church bells and the cries of traders and the prayers of a dozen rival faiths. Its own coin was struck in the royal mint, silver and gold, stamped with the devices of a Christian kingdom set down in an eastern land. Passing from hand to hand in the markets, and filling the customs houses at the ports. And moving through this world, a new and strange thing born of the Crusades were the warrior monks of the military orders. Men who had taken the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience like any monk, and yet girded on swords and armour to fight and die in defence of the holy places and the pilgrims who came to them. The Knights of the Temple, quartered on the very platform where Solomon's temple had stood, and the Knights of the Hospital, who tended the sick and the footsore in their house near the Holy Tomb, were becoming a power in the land in Melisende's lifetime. And she favoured and supported them, granting and giving as a pious ruler should, for they were the iron backbone of the land's defence and the shelter of its pilgrims. And the host carried into its battles a treasure more precious to it than any army, a great fragment of the wood on which Christ was held to have died, the relic of the true cross. Borne before the host by a bishop as the holiest of standards, the very presence of God going out with the soldiers to war. To fight beneath it was to fight with heaven's own banner overhead, and the men of the host believed, with their whole hearts, that while the holy wood went before them, they could not finally be overcome. The day that belief was broken, long after Melisende's time, would be the day the kingdom itself began to die. To rule this city was to hold the very heart of the Christian world in one's hand, and that is what Melisende's father had given her, and what her husband now meant to take. It was not done with a single dramatic stroke, no seizure that the barons could point to and resist, but in the patient, grinding way that power is usually taken through the daily business of rule, the slow accumulation of small facts, each one minor in itself. That together amounted to a queen quietly stripped of her power. Fulk simply began to govern as though Melisende were not there. The charters and grants that came out of the royal chancery, the documents by which a medieval king actually exercised his power, giving lands and confirming rights and settling disputes, began to be issued in Fulk's name alone, with no mention of the queen who was supposed to rule beside him. In one of them he is styled, with a kind of cold finality, the third king to reign in Jerusalem, counting himself the clean successor to the two Baldwins who had gone before, as though Melisende and her bloodline simply did not enter into it. Her name, the name her father had laboured for years to write into the heart of the kingdom's life, was being quietly erased from it, and Fulk did more than write her out of the parchment. He began to fill the offices and the honours of the realm with his own men, the followers he had brought with him from Anjou, the western newcomers who owed everything to him and nothing to the old order of the land. The established nobility of the land, the families who had held their lands since the days of the first Crusaders, found themselves passed over and pushed aside in favour of Fulk's imported favourites. This was a graver mistake than perhaps even Fulk understood, for it did two things at once. It insulted the proud and prickly barons of Jerusalem, men who measured their worth by their lineage and their long service, and did not take kindly to being displaced by foreigners. It cut at the legitimacy of the queen those barons had sworn to uphold, for many of them had given their oaths to Baldwin's daughter, not to her husband, and they watched the sidelining of Melisende with a growing and dangerous anger. The kingdom, which had been so carefully knit together by the old king, began to pull apart along a single deep seam, with the king and his Angevin newcomers on one side, and the queen and the native nobility on the other. And in time, as such tensions always do, it found a man to gather around, a focus and a champion for all the resentment that Fulk's high-handed rule had stirred up. That man was the queen's own kinsman, and his name was Hugh. Hugh, the Count of Jaffa, was one of the very greatest of the kingdom's lords, the holder of one of its richest and most powerful coastal lordships, and he was bound to Melisende by blood, for he was her cousin, a member of her father's wider family. He had been by every account a companion of her childhood, one of the people who had grown up alongside her in the close world of the Crusader court, and he remained close to her after her marriage. He was young, he was handsome, he was proud, and he was exactly the kind of great native baron whom Fulk's policies had most insulted. As the king's high-handedness grew, Hugh became the natural rallying point for everyone in the kingdom who felt that the rightful queen was being wronged and the old nobility trampled. He stood for the queen's cause, and he stood for the wounded pride of the men of the land. And in the poisonous atmosphere of those years that made him, in Fulk's eyes, the most dangerous man in the kingdom. And here the quarrel took a darker and more personal turn, the kind of turn that medieval courts specialised in, where high politics and whispered scandal braided together into something genuinely deadly. Because Hugh was close to the queen, and because closeness between a man and a woman at court was always fertile ground for gossip, rumours began to spread, helped along by Hugh's enemies, that the bond between the Count and Melisende was not merely the loyalty of kin, but something improper, a love affair. This was the natural element of the medieval court, this whispering, this poisoning of one ear against another, this turning of friendship and kinship into the appearance of guilt. A court was a hothouse of ambition, where dozens of proud and grasping men jostled for the favour of the crown. And the surest way to bring down a rival was to plant a doubt, to murmur a suspicion, to let a rumour do the work that no honest accusation could. Hugh's closeness to the Queen, entirely natural in a cousin and a childhood friend, was exactly the kind of thing that could be twisted into something dark by men who wished them both ill. And twisted it was. There is no good evidence that any such thing was true, and much reason to think it was simply a weapon, a piece of poison poured into the king's ear by men who wanted Hugh destroyed. But true or not, it was a charge of terrible power, for it struck at the Queen's honour and at the king's own standing as a husband, and it gave Fulk both a motive of jealousy and a pretext of justice. If the Queen could be cast as an adulteress, then her authority, her place beside the king, even the future of her infant son, might all be thrown into doubt. And what had begun as a whisper at court became a blade held to the throat of her whole position. We should be plain about how grave the danger genuinely was, for it is easy to treat a charge of adultery as mere court gossip, a matter of wounded feelings and whispered scandal. It was far more than that. The Crusader kingdom had a written code of law, hammered out in the early years of the settlement, and that code dealt with such accusations in the brutal manner of the age. A woman found guilty of the offence could be subjected to terrible bodily punishment and shut away in disgrace for the rest of her life. And the danger touched not only her own person, but the standing of her children. For a wife's faithlessness could be used to cast doubt on the legitimacy of her sons, and so on the whole succession that her father had laboured to secure. To level such a charge at a reigning queen was therefore not a private quarrel, an act of high politics, a weapon aimed at the very heart of her claim. If Melisende could be disgraced, then the careful structure of her right could be made to collapse, her infant son's birthright stained, and the whole question of who ruled Jerusalem thrown open once more. That is why the accusation, true or false, was so dangerous, and why the struggle that grew up around it was a struggle for everything. Melisende was not merely defending her honour, she was defending her crown, her children, and very possibly her freedom and her safety, against a husband who had every worldly advantage on his side. It came to a head in the year 1134, and the spark, as so often, was struck close to home within Hugh's own family. His stepson, a young man named Walter, stood up before the High Court of the kingdom and accused his stepfather of treason, of plotting against the life of the king himself. Whether Walter believed it, or whether he had been put up to it by Hugh's enemies, we cannot now say, but the charge was made in open court, in the most public way imaginable, and once it was made, it could not be unmade. This was the law of that world, strange to our eyes, but utterly serious to theirs. The belief that in a matter of accusation and denial, where no proof could be had, God himself would defend the right by granting victory to the truthful and defeat to the liar. A charge and a denial that could not otherwise be resolved were therefore put to the judgment of arms. By the custom of that warlike society, such an accusation of treachery was to be settled in the oldest way of all, by trial of battle, the two men to meet in single combat and let God show the truth through the strength of their arms. The day was set, and then Hugh, for reasons no chronicler fully explains, did not come. Whether his nerve failed him, or whether he judged that the whole proceeding was a trap rigged against him by enemies who controlled the court, or whether some other reason now lost to us kept him away, we cannot say. He failed to appear for the combat that would have cleared his name, and by failing to appear, he seemed, in the eyes of the court and the law, to confess his guilt. The Queen's champion had, in a single stroke, put himself in the wrong, and Fulk now had everything he needed to move against the man who stood at the head of his wife's party. The long, cold quarrel was about to break. At last, into open war, branded a traitor by his failure to appear, Hugh did the only thing left to a great lord with his back to the wall. He rode for his own city of Jaffa, the strong coastal fortress at the heart of his power, and he shut its gates and prepared to defend himself by force. And then he made the one move that would undo him utterly. The move that turned a sympathetic kingdom against him overnight. Desperate and outmatched, he reached out for help to the enemy at his door, to the Muslim garrison of Ascalon. The great Egyptian held fortress on the southern coast that was a constant thorn in the kingdom's side. For a Christian baron of the Holy City to ally himself with the infidel against his own anointed king was, to the men of that age, very nearly the worst thing a man could do. A betrayal not just of a king, but of the whole crusading enterprise and of God himself. Whatever sympathy Hugh had enjoyed as the wronged champion of the wronged queen began to drain away in that moment. He had handed his enemies the proof of his treachery, and he had made it very hard for even his friends to stand beside him. The war itself was short and one-sided. Fulk moved against Jaffa. The count's own vassals began to fall away from a lord who had bound himself to the enemy, and Hugh's position collapsed. He could not hold. His vassals would not fight their anointed king in the cause of a man who had joined hands with the infidel, and Hugh's brief moment of strength drained away into isolation and defeat. And at that point, with the rebel beaten and her husband triumphant, something quietly remarkable happened. Something that bears the fingerprints of Melisende all over it, even though the chroniclers do not name her hand. Instead of the savage punishment that a defeated traitor could expect, the destruction of his house and very likely his life, Hugh was offered terms of astonishing mildness. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest churchman in the kingdom, stepped in to mediate a peace, and the sentence handed down was a mere 3 years of exile, after which the count could return and take up his lands again. It was a punishment so light for so grave an offence that it can only be understood as the result of powerful pressure behind the scenes. The pressure of a queen who would not see her kinsman and champion broken on the wheel, and who had, perhaps, just enough strength of her own to insist on mercy. The court read it clearly enough. The lenient sentence was, in its way, a small victory for Melisende's party, a sign that the king could not simply do as he pleased. But the affair was not finished, and its final act would shift the whole balance of the kingdom. Hugh, sentenced to exile, lingered in Jerusalem through the autumn, waiting for the season to turn and a ship to carry him west. Picture the scene, for the chroniclers preserved it in a vivid detail unusual for that age. The disgraced count, sentenced and waiting, passing the slow days before his ship sailed in the ordinary idleness of a great man with time on his hands. And one day, as he sat at a game of dice at a table in a public street of the holy city, in the open, in the sight of passers-by, a knight came up behind him and struck him down, stabbing him again and again, and leaving him for dead in the open road. The suddenness of it, the public brazenness, a great lord cut down at his game in a busy street of Jerusalem, sent a shock of horror through the whole city. For this was no quiet murder done in the dark, no poisoning behind closed doors that might be hushed and explained away. It had been done in daylight, in a public place, before witnesses, upon a man whose only crime in the eyes of the people was to have stood for their wronged queen, and the brazen openness of it made it impossible to ignore and impossible to forgive. Hugh did not die, but he was terribly wounded, and the city erupted. For the question on every tongue was the obvious one, the question of who had sent the assassin. And the answer that the whole city leapt to, almost as one, was that it had been the king. Whether Fulk truly ordered the attack we will never know, and it is entirely possible that he did not. That some over-eager follower acted on his own to win the king's favour. But it did not matter what was true. What mattered was what people believed. And the people believed that Fulk, having failed to destroy his rival by law, had tried to murder him by stealth in the streets of the holiest city on earth. The tide of opinion, which had begun to turn against Hugh when he allied with Ascalon, now swung violently back the other way, against the king. Fulk was suddenly the villain, the foreign tyrant who stabbed wronged men in the back, and Melisende was the injured queen whose champion had been struck down. Fulk understood at once how mortal the danger was. To clear himself, he insisted that the captured assassin be tried and punished in the most public way, and that his tongue be spared so that he could testify, again and again, that he had acted entirely alone, for his own reasons, with no command from the king. The man swore it to the last. As for Hugh himself, the broken count, he recovered slowly from his terrible wounds, and when at last he was strong enough, he took ship for the west to serve out his exile, far from the kingdom whose politics had so nearly killed him. And there, in the lands of the south of Italy, he died not long after, never to return. He had been the spark that lit the whole conflagration, the man around whom the Queen's cause had rallied. And he ended his days a wounded exile in a foreign land. But the suspicion never lifted, and in truth the damage to Fulk was already done and could not be undone. For in the aftermath of the stabbing, the chronicler William of Tyre tells us, the king found that he had lost. Melisende was now so powerful, and the feeling against Fulk so strong, that the men who had spoken against the queen, who had whispered the poison about her and Hugh and cheered her sidelining, now went in real fear, for they could no longer count on the king to protect them, and the queen did not forget who they were. Fulk himself, the seasoned old soldier, who had ruled great lands all his life, was reduced to a kind of wary submission in his own household. From that time on, the same chronicler tells us, the king did not attempt to act in any matter of the kingdom, not even in the smallest things, without first securing the queen's knowledge and consent. It is worth dwelling on how complete the reversal was, for it is one of the most striking things in her whole story. A few years earlier, Fulk had been the unquestioned master of the land, issuing its acts in his name alone, filling its offices with his own men, treating his royal wife as a cipher to be honoured in word and ignored in deed. Now the positions were exactly inverted. It was Fulk who walked carefully, Fulk who looked over his shoulder, Fulk who dared not so much as grant a small favour without first making sure of the queen's goodwill. His own followers, the men who had ridden so high in his service, now feared for their futures and perhaps their lives, knowing that the queen they had helped to wrong was now the power in the land and was not likely to forget them. The whole weight of the court had shifted onto Melisende's side of the scale, and it would never shift back. The man who had set out to rule without his wife now could not rule without her at all. It is worth pausing on what Melisende had actually achieved here, because it is easy to let the drama of the dice game and the dagger carry us past it. She had been written out of her own kingdom by a powerful, experienced, determined husband, a man with every worldly advantage of age and wealth and military reputation, and within a few short years she had reversed it completely, not by raising an army, not by riding into battle, but by holding the loyalty of the kingdom's great families, by letting her husband's own arrogance turn the barons against him, and by being there, patient and unbroken, when his miscalculations brought him low. She had taken the lesson of her mother in the captivity years, the lesson that a woman's power lay in connection and nerve and the long game, and she had applied it to win back a crown. From this point on, Melisende was not a queen in name only. She was a true partner in the rule of Jerusalem, and before long, the senior partner, the poison of the Hugh affair, had, against every expectation, made her. And then, having won the war, she made the peace. There is a particular kind of wisdom in knowing when to stop, when a victory pressed too far becomes a defeat, when the destruction of an enemy costs more than his mercy would. And it is a wisdom that the proud and the vengeful almost never possess. Melisende possessed it. She had every reason and the opportunity, in the flush of her triumph, to grind her humbled husband into the dust, to drive out his followers and break his power utterly, and rule alone over the wreckage. She did not. This is the part of the story that reveals her judgment most clearly, for a lesser ruler, having gained the upper hand, might have pressed it to her husband's ruin and torn the kingdom apart in the doing. Melisende did the opposite. Once her position was secure, she and Fulk were reconciled, genuinely and lastingly, and the reconciliation held for the rest of his life. And the partnership was a real one, visible in the very records of the kingdom, for where once the charters had borne Fulk's name alone, now the axe of the crown went out in the names of both king and queen together. The formal proof in dry official language that the two of them now ruled as one. They governed together after that, two strong people who had tested each other to the breaking point and arrived on the far side at something like respect. They had a second son together, named Amalric, a child of their renewed peace, who would one day, in his turn, wear the crown of Jerusalem. There is something quietly hopeful in that birth, a child conceived, not in the cold early years of the marriage, when husband and wife had been little more than rivals sharing a title, but in the warmer season that came after the storm, when the two of them had fought each other to a standstill and arrived, on the far side, at a real and working partnership. And the line of kings that would carry the Crusader realm down to its final decades would run not through the elder son who fought his mother, for he died without an heir of his body, but through this younger one, the son of the reconciliation, born after the worst was over. And Fulk, who had learned his lesson the hard way, ruled out the remaining years of his life as the queen's true colleague rather than her master. The realm, which had so nearly cracked apart over the question of who should hold its crown, settled into a long and effective partnership. The native barons were soothed, the Angevin newcomers learned their place, and Melisende came into the fullness of her power, governing the holy city, not as anyone's wife or anyone's daughter, but as herself. The decade that followed the reconciliation was, in many ways, the making of Melisende as a ruler. The long middle stretch of her life, in which she learned the daily craft of governing a kingdom, and learned it well. From about the middle of the 1130s onward, she held a real and direct hand on the business of the realm. Her name restored to the charters, her assent required for the acts of state, her judgment sought in the matters that filled a medieval ruler's days, the granting of lands, the settling of quarrels between great men, the defence of the frontiers, the management of the church. She was not playing at it. The same chronicler who recorded her husband's humbling also recorded, with evident respect, her wisdom and her capacity. Almost everything we know of her comes in the end through that one remarkable man, and he is worth knowing, for we see her largely through his eyes. William, Archbishop of Tyre, was the great historian of the Crusader kingdom, a churchman and statesman born in the Holy Land itself, who grew up in the very world Melisende ruled, and later wrote its history in a long and thoughtful Latin chronicle that remains to this day our chief window onto that lost kingdom. He was a careful and serious man, not given to flattery, and his judgments carry weight precisely because he was capable of criticism. And on the subject of Melisende, he was, on the whole, full of admiration. praising her wisdom and her strength of purpose and her fitness to rule, setting her among the able sovereigns of the land. When we say that contemporaries thought well of her, it is largely William we mean, and his good opinion was not lightly given. He thought her a ruler of real gifts, prudent and strong, and equal to the weight she carried, and the kingdom under the joint rule of the reconciled pair enjoyed a stretch of relative peace and stability that its troubled history did not often allow. What did that rule actually look like, day upon day? It is easy to speak of governing a realm as though it were a single grand act, but the reality of medieval rule was 1,000 small things, endlessly repeated. And Melisende did them all. There were charters to be granted and confirmed, the documents by which lands and rights and privileges were given and guaranteed, each one sealed in the Queen's name. Each one a small act of power. There were disputes between proud and quarrelsome barons to be heard and settled, men forever at odds over a piece of land or a point of honour whom only the crown could hold in check. Picture her at that work, seated in the high hall before the assembled lords, hearing the long grievances of two great houses over a contested castle or a disputed inheritance, weighing the law and the custom and the tempers of the men before her, and handing down a judgment that both sides, however grudgingly, would accept. It was unglamorous and unending labour, the patient untangling of other men's quarrels, and it was the very substance of rule. For a kingdom in which the great men could not get justice from the crown was a kingdom one step from private war. That she did it year upon year, and was obeyed, is the plainest measure of what she was. There was the church to be managed, its bishops and abbots and patriarchs to be soothed and supported, and when necessary, opposed. The Holy Land was carved up among a handful of lordships, the lords of Jaffa and Galilee and Sidon and the wide barony beyond the Jordan, men who held their lands by the sword and acknowledged the crown as their head, but bent to it no further than they must. The balance between the throne and these mighty vassals was the central tension of the realm's inner life, and a ruler who could not manage it could not rule at all. The land was defended by a feudal host. The knights who held their fiefs in return for their service and rode to the muster when the crown called, a small and precious body of heavy horsemen, never numerous enough, always stretched thin across too many threats. And to know how many swords could be raised, and how long they could be held in the field before the harvest or the cost dispersed them, was knowledge on which life and death depended. It was guarded, too, by its castles, the long chain of strongholds that studded its frontiers and its coast, watching the passes and the harbours and the roads, each a knot of stone in the net that bound the country together. Everyone to be garrisoned and provisioned and kept in repair against the day the next blow fell. And it was governed by law, for the Crusader East had built itself a body of statute over the decades. And the High Court sat not only as a council of state, but as the highest court of justice in the land. All of this passed across the Queen's table. There were envoys to receive from the other Crusader states and from the powers beyond, from Constantinople and from the West. Each embassy a delicate dance of alliance and advantage, and not all of the kingdom's dealings with the Muslim world were war, for all the holy rhetoric of the crusade. The daily reality of the frontier was a tangle of truces and treaties and quiet accommodations, for the Franks were far too few to fight everyone at once, and their neighbours often had quarrels of their own that made a Christian truce convenient. Tribute was paid and received, safe passage granted to caravans, border districts shared or divided, and messengers went back and forth between Jerusalem and the courts of Damascus and Cairo, carrying the careful business of coexistence. A ruler of Melisende's experience understood that the sword was only one instrument among many, that a well-judged truce could buy a harvest or a breathing space worth more than any battle, and that the survival of the realm depended as much on knowing when not to fight as on knowing how. There were the chief officers of state to direct, the constable who led the host in the field, the marshal who saw to its horses and its order, the seneschal who managed the royal household, the chamberlain who kept the treasure, the chancellor who oversaw the charters and the records, the hands and fingers of the crown, and a ruler governed by choosing them well and holding their loyalty. And over all of it, the queen presided. In the hall of the palace, by the Tower of David, the still point around which the whole machinery turned. Nor was the court only a machine of government. It was a society, with its feasts on the high days of the church, its long tables loaded with the rich food of the country, its wine and music and the press of the foremost families in their eastern silks, the mingling of Frankish and native fashion that marked the settled Franks of the third generation. About the queen gathered the women of that society, the wives and daughters of the lords, the ladies of her household, a female sphere with its own quiet currents of influence, running beneath the public business of the men. And the loyalty of that sphere was a power no rival could easily touch. She had been raised for all of this since she was a girl, and by every account she did it well, with a grasp of detail and a steadiness of judgment that won the respect even of men who did not much like the idea of being ruled by a woman. Part of her strength lay in a thing that no charter records, which was the web of her own family, spread now across the whole of the Crusader East. Melisende was the eldest of 4 sisters, and as those sisters grew and married, they came to hold, between them, an extraordinary share of the Latin world overseas. Her sister Alice had married the Prince of Antioch, and after his death fought fierce and repeated battles to rule that great northern principality in her own right, a stormy and rebellious figure who gave the kingdom no end of trouble, but who showed, in her own wilful way, that the daughters of Morphia did not easily surrender power. In the very first year of Fulk's reign, Alice had risen in the north, seizing control of Antioch, and binding herself in alliance with the rulers of Tripoli and Edessa to keep the new king of Jerusalem from imposing his authority over them. So that Fulk had been forced to march north and fight to assert the overlordship that his father-in-law had held. Twice she was put down, and twice she clawed her way back, an unquenchable woman who would not accept that a widow could not rule, and though she was the queen's rival as often as her ally, there is something unmistakably familiar in her refusal to be set aside. The same fierce blood ran in all of them. Another sister, Hodierna, married the Count of Tripoli and became the lady of that southern state, a woman of strong temper whose own marriage would end in bitter estrangement. And the youngest, the little Ioveta, who had once been handed over as a hostage to her father's captors, had been given to the church and would in time become an abbess of great standing. For the Crusader East was not one kingdom, but several, a loose scatter of Frankish states, strung along the coast and into the hills, each with its own ruler and its own jealousies. There was the great principality of Antioch in the north, rich and proud and forever quarrelling with its neighbours. There was the county of Tripoli on the central coast. There had been the county of Edessa until it fell, and there was the kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, the holiest and, in theory, the senior of them all. These states were bound together by a common faith and a common danger, and were forever pulled apart by ambition and rivalry. And holding them in any kind of common purpose was one of the perpetual labours of whoever wore the crown of Jerusalem. 4 sisters, and between them the blood of Jerusalem ran through Antioch and Tripoli and the cloister. So that Melisende sat at the centre of a family network that touched every corner of the Crusader world. When she needed to influence affairs in the north or the south, she could reach out along ties of sisterhood that no rival could match. It was, in its quiet way, a formidable instrument of power, and it was wholly her own. There is something in all four of them worth pausing on, for together they tell us what kind of family had produced Melisende. A family of women who did not know how to be small. 4 daughters of one Armenian mother, and not one of them content to be a quiet ornament at some man's side, not the turbulent Alice forever grasping at Antioch, not the proud and unhappy Hodiana in Tripoli, not even the youngest, Ioveta in her cloister, who ruled her convent with the same firm hand her sisters brought to their counties. They were, the lot of them, rulers by temperament, and the eldest of them ruled the holiest city in the world. Whatever else may be said of the daughters of Baldwin and Morphia, no one could ever have called them meek, and in that they were their mother's children, to the last. For more than a decade, the partnership of king and queen held, and the kingdom was the steadier for it. And then, on an autumn day in the year 1143, it ended in an instant, in the way that the lives of fighting men so often ended in that age, not in battle, but by simple ill luck. The king and queen were staying at Acre, the great port city on the coast, the busiest harbour of the kingdom, and in many ways its true commercial heart. A teeming town of merchants and sailors and warehouses where the trade of the East was loaded onto the ships of Italy, and Fulk rode out hunting, as lords loved to do. The company giving chase across the open country after some fleeing creature startled from cover. And in the heat of the chase, Fulk's horse stumbled and went down, and the king was thrown and gravely hurt. Struck about the head in the fall so badly that he never woke from it. They carried him back to Acre and laid him down, and for 3 days he lingered, unconscious and beyond reach, while the queen and the court kept their helpless watch, and then he died. Fulk of Anjou, who had crossed the world to be a king, who had tried to rule without his wife and learned that he could not, who had become in the end her true and reconciled partner, was gone, suddenly and stupidly, with no enemy's hand in it at all. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about it, and that is part of what makes it linger in the mind. Here was a man who had spent his whole life among the dangers of war, who had ridden into battle against the deadliest enemies of Christendom, who might at any time in his long career of fighting have fallen gloriously sword in hand. And instead he met his end, chasing some small fleeing creature across a sunny field on an idle afternoon, undone by nothing more than a stumbling horse and a hard fall on stony ground. The great soldier laid low by bad luck and a moment's mischance. It was the kind of death that the men of that age, who lived so close to sudden ending, knew all too well. The reminder that came again and again that a life of nerve and skill and high purpose could be snuffed out in an instant by the merest accident. That no strength or rank or holy cause could buy a man's safety from a careless fall. The whole kingdom lived close to such endings, where a fever or a fall or a stray arrow could in a moment undo the work of years. And perhaps that nearness to death was part of what gave the Crusader world its strange intensity. The sense that every life was lived on borrowed and uncertain time. For Melisende, keeping her 3-day watch by the bed of the husband who would not wake, it must have been a strange grief, tangled and complicated, for they had been enemies and then partners, and never quite, perhaps, the lovers that a marriage was meant to make. And yet she wept for him, the chronicler insists, in private as well as in public, and there is no reason to doubt it. They had come a long way together, from the cold war of her first years on the throne to the steady partnership of her later ones. And now the man who had been the great rival and then the great colleague of her life was gone, and she was alone at the top of the kingdom. Whatever bitterness had once lain between them had long since been laid aside. And Melisende mourned him, the chronicler tells us, with a grief that was real and not merely the public show that a queen owed a dead king. It is a small thing, that note of genuine sorrow, but it tells us much, for it means the two of them had built, out of the wreckage of their early war, a marriage worth grieving, a partnership that had become, somewhere in the long middle years, a thing of real affection. They had begun as adversaries and ended as something close to allies, and now she was a widow. But she was something else as well. Something that changed the whole shape of the kingdom in a single stroke. She was now, with Fulk gone, the sole adult monarch of Jerusalem. Their elder son, the boy Baldwin, was only 13 years old, far too young to take up the reins of a kingdom at war. There was no question this time of a husband to share or to seize the power. No older and stronger partner waiting to push her aside. There was only herself and a boy of 13, and the whole governance of a kingdom at war to be taken up at once, in the very moment of her grief, with no time given to mourn before the business of rule pressed in. A lesser woman might have faltered at such a moment, or leaned gratefully on some strong baron who would soon have become her master. Melisende did neither. She had been ruling in all but name for years already, and she simply went on ruling, gathering the reins fully into her own hands in the hour of her widowhood, without a tremor that the records can show. And so the full weight of the crown came down, at last and completely, onto Melisende alone. They bore him the long road up from the coast to the holy city he had ruled, and laid him to rest among the kings in the great church beside the tomb of Christ, near the father-in-law who had brought him east and the predecessors whose crown he had worn. The foreign count from green Anjou come at last to his final rest in the stone of Jerusalem. A few weeks later, at the feast of the Nativity, Melisende and her young son Baldwin were crowned together as queen and king. But everyone understood where the power truly lay. The boy was king in name, his mother was the ruler in fact. And here we should be careful to understand exactly what Melisende now was, because it is easy to slide past it with a word like regent, as though she were merely a temporary stand-in, holding the throne for her son. She was far more than that, and she meant to be. By the law and custom of the kingdom, she was not simply Baldwin's guardian, but a queen in her own right, ruling by her own hereditary claim. The claim her father had so carefully built for her a generation before. The crown was hers, not merely held in trust for the boy. These were, in truth, among the better years the kingdom knew, a stretch of relative security and good order held in place by a steady hand at the centre. The frontiers were watched, the great works of building went forward, the church was content. The barons were kept in their proper place. The daily justice of the realm was done. It was unglamorous work, the patient maintenance of a realm, rather than the winning of famous victories, but it was the work that kept the realm alive. And Melisende did it with a competence that her own contemporaries, watching closely, did not hesitate to praise. And in the years that followed, she ruled it as fully and as ably as any king had done, with a firm and confident hand, governing a fractious kingdom of proud barons and rival churchmen and ever-present enemies, and governing it, by the testimony of those who watched, with real skill. She was the first woman to do such a thing in the Crusader East, the first to hold open, public, unquestioned sovereign power in that hard and masculine world, and she carried it without apology. Sit with that for a moment, for it is the heart of why she matters. The Crusader kingdoms were perhaps the most relentlessly masculine societies that the medieval world produced, states founded on conquest and held by the sword, where a ruler was first and last, a war leader, expected to don armour and ride at the head of the host into battle. It was the one thing she manifestly could not do, and it was the thing on which the whole edifice of kingship was supposed to rest. By every assumption of that world, a woman simply could not be a king. And yet here was Melisende, doing in all but the actual swinging of the sword everything that a king did, summoning the armies and directing the wars and granting the lands and judging the disputes and managing the church and receiving the envoys of emperors, governing the holiest kingdom in Christendom with a firm and capable hand, and being obeyed. She found the war leading done for her by her commanders and in time by her warrior son, and she did all the rest herself. And she did it so well that the kingdom's own chronicler, a man steeped in all the assumptions of his age, could find no better word for her than wise. She did not break the rule that a woman could not lead men into battle. She simply demonstrated, year after year, that almost everything else about ruling a kingdom could be done by a woman as well as by any man, and perhaps better than by most. That was new in her world. It had not been seen before, and she made it look, in the doing, almost ordinary. There is a dimension of her life, too, that the chronicles, written by celibate churchmen, pass over almost in silence, and that is the plain physical reality of being a royal wife and mother in that age. Melisende bore Fulk 2 sons, and childbearing was the most dangerous work that any wife of that age could undertake, a labour that killed queens as readily as peasants, and from which no wealth or station could shield her. Each birth was a small war survived, and she was expected to undergo it again and again as the price of her place. For the bearing of heirs was, in the cold logic of dynasty, the first duty of a queen. That Melisende did all of that, and governed a kingdom besides, is worth holding in mind when we measure her against the kings who had only to rule. There is a quiet revolution buried in that simple fact, easy to miss across the centuries. A thing that has never been done carries the whole weight of the impossible. A thing that has been done once and seen to work becomes merely difficult. Melisende moved her world's idea of what was possible, not by argument, but by the plain demonstration of a life, and the moving of it outlasted her. It helped, too, that the Crusader East was in some ways less harsh toward women of rank than the world the Franks had left behind. For the constant dying of men in that violent country meant that fiefs and lordships passed often enough through women, and a great heiress or a widow could find herself, by simple force of circumstance, the holder of lands and castles, and the rights that went with them. The law made room for such women, because the realm could not afford otherwise. Since a society that needed every sword also needed every claimant who could keep a lordship in loyal hands. Into that small opening Melisende stepped and made it wider than anyone had imagined it could go, and once it had been done, it could be done again. In the decades after Melisende, the crown of Jerusalem would pass more than once through the female line, to queens who reigned in their own right and chose the kings who ruled beside them, so that female sovereignty, unthinkable before her, became an accepted part of the kingdom's life. She had broken the ground. Those who came after walked on the path she had opened, very likely without ever knowing whose feet had first worn it. That is perhaps the quiet truth of all real pioneers, that their hardest victories become, in time, so ordinary that no one remembers they were ever won. And the woman who first made a thing possible is forgotten precisely because she made it possible. The years of her sole rule were not quiet ones, for the kingdom never knew calm for long. The gravest blow fell early, and it struck at the very place where Melisende's own life had begun. In the year 1144, far to the north, the county of Edessa, the oldest of all the Crusader States, was overwhelmed and conquered by a resurgent Muslim power under a formidable warlord named Zengi. For half a century the Franks had only advanced, taking city after city, planting their states along the coast and into the hills, and it had been possible to believe that God was with them and that the Holy Land would remain Christian forever. The fall of Edessa shattered that comfortable faith at a stroke, the first of the great Crusader conquests to be lost, a sign to many that the tide, so long held back, was beginning at last to turn against the Christian East. And the city that fell was no ordinary one to Melisende. It was the place of her birth, the county her father had ruled before ever he was a king, the cradle of her family's greatness. And now it was gone, swallowed back into the Muslim world from which the Crusaders had wrenched it 2 generations before. The news must have struck the Queen with a private grief beneath the public alarm, the sense of a door closing forever on the world of her childhood. Zengi was the first of a new kind of enemy, a Muslim leader strong enough to begin gathering the scattered and quarrelling powers of the region into a single purpose. And though he himself was soon struck down, his work was carried on by his son, an even more formidable figure, patient and pious and relentless, who would spend his life knitting the Muslim East together into the power that would in the end overwhelm the kingdom altogether. For a change was stirring in those years, a slow reawakening of the old call to drive the Franks back into the sea. The idea of holy war preached now with a fervour to match the Crusaders' own. And the disunity that had so long been the kingdom's salvation was beginning, year by year, to give way to a dangerous new unity among its enemies. The fall of Edessa was the first sign of that gathering storm. And it was Melisende, ruling in Jerusalem, who took the lead in sounding the alarm to the west, sending urgent word back across the sea that the Holy Land was in peril and that the kings and knights of Europe must come once more to its defence. Her appeal, joined to the cries of others, would help to set in motion the next of the great armed pilgrimages, the vast and ill-fated venture that we remember as the Second Crusade. But that is a story we will come to shortly. For a ruler's monuments outlast her quarrels. The wars are won and lost and fade into the dry pages of the chronicles. The alliances shift, the barons who schemed and the kings who fought are forgotten. But the stone endures, and the gold and the holy houses raised and endowed, standing on through the centuries as the truest testimony of what a sovereign valued. First then, in the steadier years of her power, before the kings of the West descended upon her, let us look at what Melisende did with the holy city itself, for it is here, in stone and in gold, that she left the mark that outlasted every battle. A ruler is remembered for wars and treaties, but a ruler is often revealed by what she chooses to build. And here Melisende speaks to us across the centuries more clearly than anywhere else. She was a great patron, one of the foremost builders of the medieval Holy Land. And the city of Jerusalem, as later pilgrims knew it, owed a remarkable share of its shape to her. Her grandest work was the one at the very heart of the Christian world. For the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred building in all of Christendom, raised over the place of the crucifixion and the empty tomb, was in those years being entirely rebuilt, gathered together from a scatter of older shrines into one magnificent new church in the Romanesque manner of the West, a single vast roof drawn over the holiest ground on earth. And it was Melisende, in the years of her sole power, who oversaw and drove that vast undertaking to its completion. Imagine the day of its consecration, one of the great occasions of Melisende's reign. The whole power of the kingdom gathered in and around the finished church, the patriarch and the bishops in their gold and white, the lords and ladies, the knights of the holy orders, the crowds of pilgrims and citizens pressing in to witness it, the new church blazing with light and ringing with the chant of the dedication. It fell, by careful design, upon the 50th anniversary of the day the first Crusaders had fought their way over the walls and into the city, a jubilee of the conquest. 50 years of Christian Jerusalem crowned by the completion of its greatest church. That was in the summer of the year 1149, and the soaring monument was finished under a queen's hand. For centuries afterward, the deed was quietly credited to her son, as the works of women so often were, folded into the record of a man. But the church rose in her years, and by her authority, and it stands much altered, to this day, the most enduring of all her monuments. Imagine the work of it going forward through those years, in the dust and din of the holiest building site in the world. Masons and stonecutters and carpenters by the score, drawn from east and west, labouring over the great new church. The chip and ring of chisels on limestone, the creak of cranes and hoists, the slow rising of arch and vault and dome over the most sacred ground that Christians knew. Imagine the pilgrims threading their way past the scaffolding to reach the tomb, the chanting of the clergy going on amid the construction, the Queen herself coming to see the progress of her great work, walking among the half-finished glories with her officers and her churchmen, choosing, approving, paying. The style of it was the great Romanesque manner that the Crusaders had carried with them from the west. The round arch and the massive pier and the deep carved doorway married here to the materials and the craftsmen of the East, so that the finished church was itself a meeting of worlds in stone, Western in its bones and Eastern in its making. The masons who raised it were the inheritors of centuries of skill, and the building they left has outlasted the kingdom that made it by the better part of 1,000 years. To raise such a building, in such a place, in a kingdom always short of money and forever at war, was an act of will and faith and enormous expense, and it was hers. When at last it stood complete and was consecrated in that 50th year, it gathered under one magnificent roof all the scattered holy places of the Lord's death and rising, and it became, and remained for centuries, the single grandest monument of the entire Crusader enterprise. Pilgrims who had crossed half the world to weep at the tomb of Christ would do so, from that day on, within walls that Melisende had raised. She left her mark quite literally on the centre of the Christian world. She did not stop there. She had a particular care for the religious houses of the kingdom, and she founded one that was very close to her heart, a great convent of nuns at Bethany, the village just outside the walls where the Gospels said that Christ had raised Lazarus from the dead. To understand why such places mattered so much, and why men would cross half the earth and pour out blood and treasure for them, you must enter for a moment into the medieval mind, for which the Holy Land was not a distant abstraction, but the most real and precious thing imaginable, the actual soil on which God had walked in human flesh, the very stones that had heard his voice. Every hill and village named in the Gospels was a relic in itself, a spot where heaven had touched earth, and to hold them, to walk them, to be buried in them, was to live one's faith in the most literal way the world allowed. It was holy ground, and Melisende endowed the new house with a royal generosity, granting it the rich and fertile plains around Jericho to keep it in wealth and dignity, and she installed at its head, as its abbess, the one member of her family who had been given to the church, her youngest sister, the same little Ioveta who had once been handed over as a child to her father's enemies. There is a deep and deliberate tenderness in that act that repays a moment's thought. Of all the four sisters, Ioveta was the one whose childhood had been marked by sacrifice. Given away as a small girl to be a pledge in enemy hands, so that her father might come home, carrying through her whole life, one imagines, some shadow of that early abandonment. And it was Melisende, the eldest, who lifted her into honour and security and wealth, who set her at the head of a great and beautiful house on holy ground, and endowed it richly enough that her sister would never want for anything again. The new convent rose on the very spot where, the Gospels said, a man had been called back out of the tomb, a place of resurrection and second chances, and it became one of the most richly favoured religious houses in all the kingdom. A royal abbey ruled by a king's daughter. It was patronage, yes, and politics of a kind, the binding of the church to the crown. But it was also plainly an act of love, an elder sister making right, as far as she could, the old wound of the youngest. Within its walls, a community of nuns lived out the ordered round of prayer and work and contemplation, the bells calling them through the offices of the day and the night, the great endowment of Jericho's plains, keeping them in comfort and dignity. And over them all presided Ioveta, a king's daughter turned bride of Christ, ruling her holy house with the same firmness her sisters brought to their counties, and her eldest sister to the kingdom itself. The sister who had been spent as a hostage to ransom a captive king now ruled, by her eldest sister's gift, over one of the richest convents in the Holy Land. She had a particular hand in the Church of St. Anne, raised on the spot held to be the birthplace of the Virgin's own mother, a building of grave and beautiful simplicity that still stands today among the finest works of the Crusader masons. She saw to the markets of the city, the covered streets of shops where the trade of the Holy City was carried on, ordering and improving the commerce on which Jerusalem lived. She tended the shrine of the tomb of the Virgin in her beloved valley of Jehoshaphat, the very place where she herself would one day be buried. She restored, too, the cathedral of the Armenians, her mother's people, so that her patronage reached across the divisions of the Christian world and touched Latin and Eastern faithful alike. Nor was her giving all in stone and gold, for a Christian ruler was bound above all to the care of the poor and the sick and the stranger. And here too Melisende answered the call of her faith, supporting the great hospital of the Holy City, where the orders of warrior monks tended the sick pilgrims who arrived broken by their long journeys, and giving, as a pious queen should, to the relief of the suffering who gathered, as they always did, in the shadow of the wealthy church. In all of it, there is a single consistent character, the care of a ruler who saw the Holy City not merely as a fortress to be held, but as a treasure to be made worthy of the sacred things it sheltered, a city to be built up and beautified and tended, generation upon generation, as an offering. And the Holy City lived by a calendar unlike any other, its year a constant round of feasts and processions and pilgrim observances, the great days of the church drawing crowds to the sacred places. The route of Christ's passion walked and walked again by the faithful through the narrow streets. The air of the city thick on the high feasts with chant and incense, and the murmur of prayer in a dozen tongues. To be the sovereign of such a place was to be the guardian of something that belonged, in a sense, to the whole of Christendom, and Melisende wore that charge as the deepest part of her crown. And then there is the small and exquisite thing that perhaps tells us most of all, a book. There survives from her court a psalter, a richly illuminated book of psalms that has come to be known as the Melisende Psalter. And it is one of the supreme treasures of the art of the Crusader kingdom. It was made for her, or given to her, in the years of her marriage. And it is a thing of astonishing beauty, its pages glowing with gold and colour, its covers carved from ivory and set with gems. We can picture dimly the workshop that produced it, somewhere in the Holy City, where artists trained in the differing traditions of East and West bent over the small leaves by lamplight, grinding their precious pigments, laying the gold, carving the ivory of the cover's panel by tiny panel, a labour of many hands and many months to make a single book worthy of a queen's devotion. Such a workshop was itself a small monument of the Crusader world, a place where the artistic tongues of three cultures met over a shared task, and the book it produced is the finest flower of that meeting that has survived to our own day. What makes it remarkable beyond its beauty is what it is made of, for it is not a purely Western book at all. Its art draws together the traditions of the Latin West, the Byzantine Greek East, and the Armenian world of her mother, fused into something new and particular to that strange meeting place of cultures that was Crusader Jerusalem. The Psalter is, in a way, a picture of Melisende herself, of the doubleness that had been hers since birth. The Frankish and the Armenian, the Western and the Eastern, gathered into one rich and luminous whole. Turn its pages in your imagination, the small thick leaves heavy with gold leaf and lapis and vermilion, the figures of the saints rendered with the long solemn faces and the great dark eyes of the Eastern manner, the Latin words of the Psalms marching down the page in a Western hand, the whole bound between covers of carved ivory, worn smooth by the touch of a queen's fingers at her prayers. A book made to be held in the hands and prayed over in the quiet of a private chapel. A thing of intimate devotion rather than public display, and yet in its very making a small monument to everything its owner was. For who else but Melisende could such a book have been made for? A book that was at once Latin and Greek and Armenian, Roman in its faith and Eastern in its beauty, belonging wholly to no single tradition and drawing strength from all of them. The Psalter is the closest thing we have to a portrait of her inner life, the private piety of a woman whose public life was all struggle and command. And it tells us that at the centre of all that striving there was a soul at prayer, formed by two worlds, at home in the meeting of them. Hold that little book in your mind as a kind of emblem of her, a woman of mixed blood, ruling a mixed kingdom, who made of that mixture not a weakness, but a thing of beauty and of strength. And it is worth saying that a remarkable amount of what she made has outlived the wreck of her world. The church she rebuilt over the Holy Tomb still stands, much battered by the centuries. The grave and lovely church of St. Anne endures. And the Psalter survives too, that small jewel of a book, carried out of the doomed kingdom before its fall and kept safe through 800 years of war and accident, so that the very pages over which a Crusader queen once bent her head in prayer can still, by good fortune, be turned and seen. It is more than most rulers leave behind. The men who fought beside her and against her are dust and a few dry lines in a chronicle. Melisende left stone and gold and a book of psalms, things that a hand can still touch. But the world beyond her workshops and her churches would not leave the kingdom in peace. And in the very years when her great church was rising, the Holy Land was overrun by the grandest and most disastrous of all the crusading ventures of her lifetime. The fall of Edessa had stirred Christendom to its depths, and the call had gone out across Europe for a new crusade to come to the rescue of the threatened East. It had been carried by the most powerful voice of the age, a fiery and saintly abbot whose preaching could move whole nations. And at his word, kings and dukes and humble men alike had sewn the cross onto their garments and sworn to march to the rescue of the Holy Land, until half of Christendom seemed to be on the move. And come it did. In the years around 1147 and 1148, two of the mightiest monarchs of Europe, the King of France and the German Emperor, took the cross and led enormous armies on the long and terrible road east, and the whole splendid, doomed expedition came pouring at last into Melisende's kingdom. For the Queen it was an extraordinary moment, the Holy City playing host to the crowned heads of the West, the small Crusader realm, suddenly the focus of the whole Christian world's hopes. The armies had paid a fearful price merely to arrive, for the long overland road through the lands of the Greek Empire and the mountains beyond had been a slaughterhouse. The German host all but destroyed by hunger and ambush before it ever reached the Holy Land, the French faring little better. So that the great force which finally gathered in the kingdom was the battered remnant of the vast multitude that had set out. What had begun in Europe as the most splendid army in living memory limped into the East, already half broken, its strength and its confidence bled away on the terrible march. And the men who had survived were in no humour to be patient or wise. Picture the sheer spectacle of it descending upon her kingdom. The roads choked with the greatest army the Holy Land had seen in 2 generations. The banners of France and Germany and 100 lesser lords streaming in the dusty heat, the camps spreading across the plains, the foreign tongues and foreign manners filling the streets of Jerusalem to bursting. and in the train of the French king came his queen, a young woman whose own name would ring down the centuries far louder than Melisende's, the celebrated Eleanor of Aquitaine, riding to the Holy Land at the head of her own ladies. So that for a brief season too of the most formidable women of the entire medieval age were present together in the Crusader East, the famous Duchess from the West and the Queen who actually ruled the Holy City, their paths crossing for a moment in the great doomed adventure of the Crusade. Here were the King of France and the German Emperor, the two mightiest monarchs of the Latin West, come in person to the city Melisende ruled, kneeling at the holy places, gathering in council with her and her young son to decide the fate of the East. For the daughter of a frontier count, who had been born in a dangerous little county at the edge of the world, it was a dizzying elevation, the whole power of Christendom converging on her doorstep, and it carried, beneath the glory, a terrible weight of expectation, for all those swords and all those princes had come at the kingdom's call. And if their great venture failed, the failure would echo back upon the Holy Land that had summoned them. The great men gathered in council near Acre to decide how the vast new army should be used, and Melisende and her young son sat among them. What followed was one of the bitterest failures in the whole history of the Crusades. The council, after much argument, settled on a target that has puzzled historians ever since: the ancient and storied city of Damascus. For of all the cities the new army might have chosen, it was among the strangest, since Damascus had for years been less an enemy of Jerusalem than an uneasy friend. A Muslim power that feared the gathering strength to its own north as much as the Franks did, and had at times made common cause with them against it. A buffer the kingdom might have done far better to keep on its side. To attack it was to turn a wary neighbour into an open foe, and to drive it into the arms of the very enemy the crusade had come to fight. It was, in the cold judgment of hindsight, a grave blunder, the squandering of a great opportunity on a target that should never have been chosen. But choose it they did. In the heated councils where too many proud princes each pressed his own design, the combined armies marched on Damascus in the heat of summer and laid siege to it, and the siege was a catastrophe. It collapsed in a matter of days, undone by poor decisions and worse luck and the mutual suspicion of too many proud commanders, and the great host of the Second Crusade, the flower of European chivalry that had crossed half the world at such cost, withdrew in disorder and humiliation, having achieved precisely nothing. Imagine the bitterness of that collapse, the greatest army the Holy Land had seen in living memory, the kings of the West and the flower of their knighthood, melting away in confusion and mutual blame after only a handful of days before the walls. The whole vast effort and expense and hope of it spent for absolutely nothing. The newcomers blamed the local Franks for the failure, muttering of treachery and self-interest, certain that the settlers of the East had sold them out for some private advantage, and the Franks of the kingdom for their part. Or thought the Western kings proud and ignorant, men who had blundered into a country they did not understand and wrecked a great opportunity through their own folly. There was bitterness on every side, and it did lasting harm, for it poisoned the well of Western goodwill on which the kingdom depended for the reinforcements that kept it alive. The kings went home defeated and embittered. The prestige of the Crusader States was badly shaken, and the whole venture left behind it a legacy of recrimination and mistrust between the Franks of the East and the Franks of the West that would linger for years. Melisende had helped to summon that great army, and she had watched it dissolve in failure at her realm's gates. It was not a thing she could have prevented, for the disaster was the work of many hands, but it was part of the hard education of her later reign, a reminder that even the mightiest help from the West could turn to ash, and that her kingdom, in the end, would have to rely upon itself. And through all of this, quietly at first and then less quietly, a new tension was growing inside the royal house itself. that the tension that would bring on the final and most painful struggle of Melisende's life. For her son Baldwin was no longer a boy. He had been a child of 13 when his father died and his mother took up the rule, and in those early years he had no choice but to let her govern in his name. But children grow, and Baldwin grew into an able and ambitious young man, every inch the son of a king, eager to take up the power that was, after all, supposed to be his. By the law of the kingdom, he came of age in the middle of the 1140s, old enough now to rule in his own person. And yet the years passed, and his mother did not step back. She had tasted real power, had wielded it well and long, had ruled the holy city with a strong hand through war and crusade. And she did not intend to hand it over and retire quietly into the shadows simply because the boy had grown a beard. Melisende meant to go on ruling. And Baldwin, watching his rightful authority withheld year after year by the mother who held the crown, began, slowly, to burn. It is a very human tragedy, this, and there is no villain in it, only two strong people who both believed, with some justice, that they were in the right. Put yourself for a moment in the young king's place. He was the son of a king and the grandson of a king, raised from birth in the certain knowledge that the crown of Jerusalem would one day be his, that he was the rightful sovereign, the man the kingdom would look to. He had grown into an able and energetic prince, brave in the field, eager to take up the great work of his fathers. And year after year he watched the power that was his by every law and custom kept firmly in his mother's hands, watched her rule and grant and decide while he stood waiting in the wings, a king in name who was permitted no kingdom. The waiting must have galled him beyond bearing. And now put yourself in Melisende's place, and the matter looks entirely different. She had not seized the crown. It was hers, by the same hereditary right her son now claimed, granted to her by her own father and confirmed by the oaths of the realm. She had ruled long and ruled well, through war and crusade and every kind of danger, and she had every reason to believe, watching her hot young son, that the kingdom was safer in her tried hands than in his untried ones. Each of them held a piece of the truth, and the two pieces could not be reconciled, and so the thing ground slowly toward the open break that neither, perhaps, truly wanted. Here the story folds back on itself in a way so exact that it is almost painful to watch. For Melisende, faced with a younger person, hungry for the power she held, did precisely what had once been done to her. She began, deliberately, to push her son to the margins. Where once it had been Fulk, who issued the kingdom's acts in his name alone and left his wife's name off the parchment, now it was Melisende who governed in her own name and let her sons slip quietly out of the documents of state. By about the year 1150, she had so reduced Baldwin's part in the rule that his name had all but vanished from the charters, the same erasure she had suffered as a young queen at the hands of an older spouse. Now worked by her own will upon her own child, she had become, in this one terrible respect, the thing that had once oppressed her. Whether she saw the likeness, whether it troubled her, we cannot know, for she left us no confession of it. Perhaps she told herself that it was different, that she ruled by right and ruled well, that the realm was safer in her experienced hands than in those of an untried youth. Perhaps she was even correct. But to the young man watching his birthright withheld, the justice of it would have meant nothing at all. He saw only that the crown was his by every law and custom, and that his own mother would not let him have it. The kingdom, as it always did in such quarrels, began to take sides, and the men of power found themselves forced to choose between the queen and the king, between the mother, who had ruled them well for years, and the son who was the rightful heir. This was no small thing, for the church in the Crusader East was a power in its own right, its great patriarch of Jerusalem, a figure who could rival the crown itself, its bishops and abbots holding broad lands and commanding the consciences of the faithful. A ruler who held the church's goodwill held a mighty ally, a ruler who lost it courted disaster. And Melisende, through all her years of generous patronage and pious building, had bound the church to her as few rulers could, so that when the breach with her son came, the men of God stood, for the most part, on her side. The church, by and large, stood with Melisende, for she had been its great patron and protector, and the bishops valued her steady wisdom. Many of the barons of the south, the heartland around Jerusalem and Nablus, stood with her too, for she had governed them long and they trusted her. But Baldwin had his own following, the younger and more restless men, those who looked to the future and to the king, who would in time outlive his mother, and his cause had the one advantage that in the end outweighs all others, which was that he was right, the crown was his. And in the early months of the year 1152, the young king moved to claim it. He went first to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest churchman of the kingdom, and demanded to be crowned again, alone this time, in a great public ceremony without his mother at his side. A coronation that would proclaim to the whole world that he, and he alone, was now the king. The Patriarch, who favoured Melisende, refused to perform it. But Baldwin would not be denied his moment. If he could not have a solemn crowning, he would make his own. He had himself decked with a wreath of laurel, the ancient sign of triumph. And he paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, crowned in that defiant fashion, showing himself to the people as their true and sovereign king. It was a gesture half of theatre and half of menace. A young man dressing himself in the symbols of victory and walking them through the holy city for all to see, declaring without a single word spoken that he was the rightful ruler and that no patriarch's refusal and no mother's claim could make him otherwise. The crowds that watched him pass would have understood it perfectly. Here was the king, the real king, the son and heir, showing himself to his people over the head of the queen, who would not step aside. It was a declaration of war dressed as a procession, and the city held its breath. Then he carried the quarrel to the high court, the great assembly of the realm, and demanded that it settle the matter once and for all by dividing the kingdom between them, giving him his own portion to rule outright. The court, desperate to avoid open war between mother and son, did as he asked and carved the kingdom in two. To Baldwin went the north, the great coastal cities and the lands of Galilee, the more warlike frontier where a young king's energy could be turned against the realm's enemies. To Melisende went the south, the rich and settled heartland, Jerusalem itself, the holy city she had ruled for so long, and her city of Nablus, and the lands around them. One can almost see the great men of the high court, labouring to find a way out, casting about for some arrangement that might satisfy both the rightful king and the long-ruling queen without forcing the land into the horror of open war within the royal house. The partition was their answer, a splitting of the realm down the middle, so that each might rule a portion and neither be wholly cast down. On paper, it was a reasonable compromise, a way to give the young man his due without stripping the queen of everything. But it satisfied no one, least of all Baldwin, who did not want half a kingdom but the whole of it, and who held, with the cold clarity of ambition, that a realm divided was a realm fatally weakened. Within weeks of the settlement, before the ink was well dry, he tore it up. He gathered his forces, and he invaded his mother's half of the realm. And here the son showed that he was, after all, his father's child and his grandfather's grandson, a soldier to the bone. He moved fast, and he moved hard, and the southern lands that had been granted to his mother could not stand against him. Town after town opened its gates or fell to his advance. Nablus, Melisende's own city, went over to the young king, and then he came to Jerusalem itself, the holy city, his mother's seat and the heart of her power. And the city did not hold for her, whether from fear of a siege, or from a judgment that the rightful king must be obeyed, or simply from the eternal instinct of a city to side with the winning power. Jerusalem opened to Baldwin and welcomed him as its king. And Melisende, the queen who had ruled the holy city for more than 20 years, who had built its greatest church and filled its convents and held its throne against every rival, found herself with the ground gone from beneath her feet. Abandoned by her own capital, with her son's army at the gates, and nowhere left to go. She did not flee, and she did not surrender in the open. She withdrew, with her younger son Amalric at her side, and a small band of those who stayed loyal to the last, into the one place in Jerusalem that could still be held. The great citadel by the western gate that men called the Tower of David, the ancient stronghold whose massive stones had guarded the city since the days of the old kings. There, behind those mighty walls, the Queen of Jerusalem shut herself up against her own son's army, and the strangest and most sorrowful siege in the kingdom's history began. The Tower of David was, and is, one of the oldest and strongest places in all Jerusalem, a great citadel of massive ancient stone rising hard by the western gate, its lower courses laid down, men believed, in the very days of the kings of old. It had guarded the city for 1,000 years and more, the last redoubt, the place a ruler retreated to when all else was lost, and now it sheltered a queen against her own child. Imagine the strangeness of those days within its walls, the queen and her younger son and her small band of the faithful shut up in the cool, dim halls of the citadel, looking down from the high ramparts over the rooftops of the holy city. The city she had ruled for more than 20 years, now held against her by the army of the boy she had borne. Below in the streets, her son's soldiers, around her, the loyal few who had not gone over, and between them only the great old stones, holding off for a few last days the inevitable end. There was no glory in this siege, no foreign enemy to hate, no holy cause to die for, only the wretchedness of a family at war with itself in the sight of the whole kingdom and the whole world. It was the lowest point of Melisende's long life. The proud queen run to earth at last, in the final stronghold of her own capital, and it was her own son who had run her there. Picture it for a moment, for it is a thing worth holding still to see. The first woman ever to rule the Crusader East, the daughter of one king and the widow of another, besieged in a tower in the holiest city on earth by the king who was her own flesh and blood. The boy she had carried and crowned and ruled for, now arrayed in arms against her below. Mother and son, queen and king, the one who had given the power and the one who meant to take it, separated by the stones of a single tower in a quarrel that no one could truly win. The siege did not last long, and it did not end in blood, for neither side, in the end, truly wished to destroy the other. Wiser heads stepped in, the churchmen and the great barons, who could not bear to see the royal house tear itself apart in the sight of the realm's enemies, and they pressed both queen and king toward a settlement. Melisende, shut in her tower, with her capital lost and her cause all but spent, could see the truth of her position clearly enough. She agreed to come to terms. She would lay down the crown and the rule of the realm, and yield the holy city and the government to her son. In return, she would keep her own city of Nablus and the lands about it, to hold and to rule for the rest of her life. A queen still in her own domain, if no longer over the whole realm. It was a bitter settlement for a woman who had ruled the whole land, the trading of a realm for a single city, and yet it was not nothing. And it was wrung from a position of near total defeat. She would not be a prisoner, nor an exile, nor a pensioner, living on her son's grudging charity, but the Lady of Nablus in her own right. And Nablus received her by every sign, not as a fallen woman to be pitied, but as its own true lady come home. For the southern lands had stayed loyal to her through the whole quarrel and did not love her the less for her defeat. And Baldwin, for his part, swore a solemn oath that he would not trouble her there, that he would leave her in peace to live out her days in the city that was now hers. So the tower opened, and the siege ended, and Melisende came down from the walls, a defeated woman, stripped of the great power she had held for 2 decades, brought low at last not by any foreign enemy, but by the son she had raised. The road there ran north from the holy city, up through the bare and rolling hills of the country's spine, a day's journey and more through a hard, beautiful land of stone, terraces and olive groves and small walled towns. The same country her mother and sisters had travelled long ago coming south to the throne, and that she now travelled in the other direction, away from the crown and toward the quieter life that remained to her. She went to Nablus, the pleasant inland town in its green valley between 2 mountains, an old and prosperous place that had been hers for years and was now to be her whole world. And it might have seemed, to anyone watching, that the long and remarkable career of the Queen of Jerusalem was finished, her story closed, her part in the realm's life at an end. But it was not finished. Not quite, for Melisende, even in defeat, was not a woman the realm could simply set aside. The years that followed her defeat are, in their own quiet way, the most revealing of her whole life, for they show us what Melisende was made of once the crown had been taken from her. A smaller spirit, humiliated and stripped of power by her own child, might have retreated into bitterness, into the long, sour grievance of the deposed, nursing her wrongs in her city of Nablus and waiting for death. Melisende did nothing of the kind. She settled into Nablus and ruled it well, as she had ruled everything well, and she let the storm of the quarrel subside. And then, patiently, she did what she had always done best. She made herself necessary again. For Baldwin, having won his crown by force, soon discovered the hard truth that his mother had known for 20 years, which is that seizing power and wielding it are 2 very different arts. Winning a kingdom and running one, he was learning, called for entirely different gifts. He was a fine soldier, bold and gifted in the field, but the day-to-day governance of a realm, the management of its church and its law and its tangled web of loyalties, was work he had neither the patience nor the long experience to do alone. And there, in Nablus, sat the one person in all the land who understood that work better than anyone living, who had done it for 2 decades, and who happened also to be his mother. So the breach began to heal, not all at once, but steadily, as breaches do when both sides have reason to want them healed. Within a year or 2 of the siege, mother and son were reconciled in more than name. Baldwin came to value her counsel, to lean on her experience, to draw her back toward the centre of affairs, not as the rival he had fought, but as the wise elder whose judgment he had come to trust. And there were many such campaigns. For Baldwin proved to be exactly the warrior the kingdom needed, forever in the saddle, forever pressing against its enemies. In the very year after their quarrel was settled, he led the long effort that won the realm one of its longest sought prizes, the capture of the powerful coastal fortress that had so long menaced the southern frontier, a triumph that secured the realm's flank and marked him out as a ruler of real ability. But a king on campaign is one absent from the daily work of rule, and the country could not govern itself. When he went off on his campaigns, as a warlike young monarch constantly did, leading the royal armies against its enemies, it was often Melisende who held the reins of government in his absence, governing the realm as regent, while her son was away at the wars. We can still trace her hand in these later years through the documents that survive. charters and grants that carry her name and her authority. The dry but unmistakable proof that the Queen of Nablus remained a person of consequence whose word still moved lands and confirmed rights and settled affairs. She had not been swept into irrelevance as a deposed ruler so easily might be. She had been folded back into the life of the kingdom on new terms, an elder power rather than the supreme one. And she went on exercising real authority almost to the end. The woman who had been besieged in a tower was within a few short years once again one of the most powerful figures in the land. No longer the sovereign, but something perhaps more durable. The respected matriarch whose hand was felt in every great decision, whose name still carried weight in the High Court and the Church and the Chanceries. She had lost the crown and kept the power, or at least a great and lasting share of it, and she had done it the way she did everything, by being too capable to set aside. There is one episode from these later years that shows her moving through the wider world of the Crusader East with all her old authority, and it is a dark and dramatic one. Her sister Hodierna, the Countess of Tripoli, was trapped in a wretched marriage to the Count Raymond, a jealous and difficult man, and the union had grown so bitter that it threatened the peace of that whole northern state. Melisende, ever the head of her family and ever the peacemaker, travelled north to Tripoli to try to mend the quarrel between her sister and her sister's husband, to broker some settlement that would let the marriage and the county survive. It was decided, as part of the cooling of tempers, that Hodierna should travel south for a time, away from her husband, in the company of her sister, the Queen. And as the two royal sisters set out from the city, the Count Raymond rode a little way with them to see them off, and then turned back toward the gate of Tripoli. And there, at the very gate of his own city, he was set upon and struck down and killed by members of the dreaded sect of killers that the Crusaders called the Assassins. The shadowy order whose name has come down into our own language as a word for murder. The first of the great Frankish lords to die at their hands, cut down within sight of the sisters who had just left him. These assassins were a thing that the Crusaders never fully understood and never ceased to dread. A secretive sect of the Muslim world, masters of the patient and silent killing that struck down the great and the well-guarded in the midst of their own followers, in the open street, in the heart of their own strongholds, by men who gave their own lives to do it and could not be turned aside by any wall or any guard. To die by their hand was to be reminded that no power and no caution could buy a man perfect safety in that world, that death might wear any face and wait in any crowd. And it was at the gate of his own city, having just bidden farewell to the Queen of Jerusalem and her sister his wife, that the Count of Tripoli met that silent end. It is a strange, grim vignette, and it places Melisende exactly where she had spent her whole life, at the centre of the kingdom's affairs, moving between its courts and its quarrels, and is a fixed point of authority and family around which the violent world of the Crusader East turned. Through all of this she remained what she had been since her girlhood, a woman of deep and genuine piety, and her devotion deepened, as devotion often does, in her later years. Her faith was no mere matter of public observance, of being seen at the right altars on the right days, though a ruler's piety was always partly that. It ran deeper, by every sign we have, into the private hours of prayer over her beautiful psalter, into the steady patronage of holy houses that brought no political advantage, into the choices of a long life that returned again and again to the service of the church and the care of the sacred places. She had been formed by holiness from her earliest years, raised in a kingdom whose whole reason for being was the guarding of the places where God had walked, and the devotion seems to have been genuinely her own and not a thing put on for show. She went on giving to the church, went on tending the religious houses she had founded and favoured, went on living the faith that had shaped her from the candlelit coronation of her childhood to the great church she had raised over the Holy Tomb. Nablus itself was no mean consolation, an old and thriving town set in a fertile valley between two mountains, well watered and green, a place of gardens and orchards and busy markets, one of the pleasantest spots in all the kingdom. To hold it was no small thing, and Melisende held it well, ruling her town and its lands as she had once ruled the whole realm. In miniature now, but with the same care. Her city of Nablus prospered under her care. Her counsel was sought and valued. If her story had to have a defeat in it, and it did, then it is a mark of the woman that she turned even that defeat into a long and dignified afterglow of influence, refusing to the last to be set aside, working her way back toward the centre of things by the only means she had ever needed, which was the plain fact of being better at the work than anyone else alive. Her younger son Amalric deserves a particular word, for of her two boys it was he who stood by her. He had been at her side in the Tower of David, in the bitter days of the siege, a young man sharing his mother's defeat, and he never seems to have turned against her as his elder brother did. When his time came, he proved an able and serious king in his own right, a man of learning and law who pushed the crown's ambitions south toward the wealth of Egypt, and it was through him, not through the brother who had besieged their mother, that Melisende's blood ran on to wear the crown. And the line ran forward from her, down through her sons, into the very last and most poignant chapter of the realm she had ruled. Her elder son Baldwin, the king who had besieged her and then come to honour her, took up the full rule once the question of the crown was settled, and reigned on for a decade after his mother's retreat, a vigorous and capable ruler who expanded the borders of the realm and held it together through dangerous years, and came in time to be reckoned among the better kings the Crusader East produced. He married late a Greek princess from the great imperial house of Constantinople, binding the realm for a season to the mighty empire of the East. But he died young, still in his early 30s, worn out perhaps by the ceaseless labour of his wars, and he left behind him no child to follow him. And so the crown passed to her younger son, the Amalric, who had been born of her reconciliation with Fulk, the child who had sheltered with her in the Tower of David during the siege. Amalric became king in his turn, and from Amalric the line ran on to his own son, Melisende's grandson, a boy who would become one of the most haunting figures in all the history of the Holy Land. For that grandson was Baldwin IV, the boy king who was discovered, while still a child at his lessons, to be losing the feeling in his hands, and who grew up to rule Jerusalem bravely and well from beneath the slow advance of the disease we call leprosy. There is a terrible poignancy in the thought of him, this grandson of the indomitable queen, a young man of courage and intelligence, cursed with a disease that ate slowly at his flesh and would in time blind and cripple and kill him, and who nonetheless took up the burden his grandmother had carried and bore it as bravely as she had, riding out at the head of his knights with his ruined hands wrapped and his face hidden, winning victories that older and sounder men could not, refusing to lay down the crown so long as a breath was in him. In him, in his courage and his refusal to yield, something of Melisende plainly lived on, the same stubborn strength that had carried her through her own long battles. Passed down through the blood to a grandson she had held as an infant in the last years of her life. He was the heir of her blood and her crown, and in his short and valiant reign, the realm she had built and ruled and fought for reached the last of its strength. For the tide, in the end, could not be held, and here the long shadow of Melisende's life reaches its furthest edge. A generation after her death, the scattered Muslim powers that had so often saved the Crusaders by their disunity were at last gathered into one hand, the hand of the great Kurdish Sultan Saladin. And against that gathered strength the kingdom could not stand. In the year 1187, a little more than a quarter century after Melisende was laid in her grave. The whole fighting force of the kingdom was lured out into the waterless hills and annihilated in a few dreadful hours upon a pair of low hills called the Horns of Hattin. With the army gone, there was nothing left to hold the walls, and within months the holy city itself, the Jerusalem that Melisende had ruled and adorned and loved, surrendered to Saladin, and the Crusader hold on the sacred places was broken forever. For nearly 90 years the Franks had held the holy city, and in a single season it was gone. The cross taken down from the great church Melisende had raised. The kingdom reduced to a thin strip of coast, clinging on for another century, in diminished and desperate form, but never again to hold the prize for which the whole vast adventure had been undertaken. The world she had known, the world her family had ruled, passed away within the memory of men who had been children at her funeral. The great church she had raised over the tomb passed into other keeping. The throne she had fought her husband and her son to keep ceased, in any real sense, to exist. She did not live to see it, and that is perhaps a mercy. But the kingdom whose long evenings she had presided over was, even in her own lifetime, a thing living on borrowed time, and the woman who had held it so firmly for so long stands now, in hindsight, as one of the last figures of its high summer, before the autumn came. But we have run ahead of ourselves, racing forward to the fall, and we must come back now to the woman herself, to the close of her own life, which came gently in the end, and surrounded by those who loved her. By the year 1161, Melisende was an old woman by the measure of her age, well past 50, worn by a life that had held more of struggle and command than most lives ever hold. She was tended, no doubt, by the physicians of the kingdom, the learned men of East and West, whose medicine, for all its herbs and its careful observation, had no remedy for what was coming, and in that year her health gave way. She suffered what we would now most likely call a stroke, a sudden failing that left her memory clouded and her strength broken, and from it she did not recover. She was carried into the slow twilight of a final illness, her sharp mind dimmed. The queen who had remembered every charter and every loyalty and every slight now slipping loose from the very recollection of her own great life. And here, at the very end, the story closes a circle that had been open since her childhood. For in her last illness, Melisende was not abandoned. She was nursed and tended and watched over by her sisters, by Hodierne, the widowed Countess of Tripoli, and by Ioveta, the Abbess of Bethany, the two who remained of the 4 daughters of Morphia, the little sister who had once been given away as a hostage to ransom their father, and whom Melisende had later raised to rule a great convent, now sat at the dying queen's bedside and cared for her in her helplessness. The bonds of sisterhood that had been the quiet strength of Melisende's whole life held fast to the very last, and she went out of the world not as a deposed and lonely queen, but as a sister surrounded by sisters, tended by the women who had shared her strange and extraordinary beginning in the frontier dangers of Edessa half a century before. Picture those final days, in a quiet chamber somewhere in the city, or in her beloved Nablus, the shutters drawn against the bright eastern light. The queen who had commanded armies and raised cathedrals and faced down a husband and a son, now grown frail and confused, her great memory failing her at the last, slipping loose from the very story of her own life. They had been 4 little girls together in a frontier town at the edge of the world. Now 2 of them sat tending the third as she went out of it. The whole long arc of that remarkable family bent down. She had lived more than 50 years, an unusually long span for that age and that hard country, and had outlasted very nearly everyone who had shared her beginnings, her parents, her husband, her great rival cousin. most of the men who had fought for her or against her. And the kingdom she had ruled took note of her passing, for whatever the quarrels of her later years, she had been its queen for the better part of a lifetime, the last living link to the founding generation. The daughter of the second Baldwin and the granddaughter, through her mother, of the older Christian East. And there were many still living who remembered when she had held the whole realm in her hand. On a September day in the year 1161, Melisende died. They buried her where it was fitting that she should lie, in the place we were asked to hold in mind at the very start of all this. The Abbey Church of St. Mary, in the green valley of Jehoshaphat. Below the eastern wall of the city, in the shrine that sheltered the supposed tomb of the Mother of God, and which she herself had restored and adorned in the years of her power. And there, in that quiet and holy hollow beneath the walls of the city she had ruled, she was laid to rest beside her own mother, the Armenian Morphia who had freed a captive king by spending her own child, and who had shown a watching daughter, long ago, what a woman's hands could do. Mother and daughter, the two queens of that remarkable family, lie together still in the valley below Jerusalem, their resting place visited by the pilgrims who came down into the valley to pray at the tomb of the Virgin. Most of them, never knowing whose bones lay near, a quiet station on the pilgrim road, their story very largely forgotten by the world that hurried past above them. There is a fittingness in that resting place that the people of her own age would have felt more keenly than we can. For the deep hollow beneath the eastern wall, between the city and the Mount of Olives, was held to be the very ground where, at the end of all things, the dead of the whole earth would be raised up and gathered for the last judgment. To lie there was to lie at the threshold between this world and the next, among the holiest of the sleeping dead, in the surest of all places, to await the resurrection. For a sovereign who had spent her years in the service of the sacred city, who had laboured to make it worthy of the holy things it sheltered, there could have been no more fitting bed in which to wait out the slow centuries until that final morning came. What, in the end, are we to make of her? This woman who ruled the holy city for so long and is now so little remembered. The historians who have studied her life do not entirely agree, and it is right that you should know it. For she was a real person and not a tidy legend, and real people resist a single, simple verdict. It is worth asking, before we weigh her, why a ruler of such consequence should have faded so far from memory, for fade she did, her name unknown today, to all but the students of that distant realm, while far lesser kings are remembered. Part of the answer is simply that she was a woman. And the writing of history was for centuries the work of men who found it easy to fold a queen's achievements into the record of the fathers and sons and husbands around her. To credit her great church to her son, and her rule to her menfolk, and to let her own figure blur and recede. Part of it is that the state she ruled did not last, that within a century of her death, the whole Crusader venture had collapsed, and the holy city was lost, so that the rulers of that doomed enterprise came to seem, from the distance of centuries, mere footnotes to a failure. And part of it, perhaps, is that her story has no single clean shape, no martyrdom or famous victory to fix it in the memory. Only the long and tangled labour of a life spent holding power and wielding it. Some have seen in her a grasping figure, a mother who clung too long and too hard to a power that was not rightly hers to keep, who wronged her own son as she herself had been wronged, and who weakened the land by her stubbornness at a moment when it could least afford division. Others, and they are perhaps the larger number now, have seen something closer to greatness, a ruler of rare ability and nerve who governed a brutal and dangerous realm with wisdom and strength for the better part of 30 years, who held her own in a world made entirely by and for men, and who left behind her, in stone and gold and the steady administration of a hard land, a record that any king of her age would have been proud to claim. These see in her not an usurper, but a pioneer, the woman who proved that the thing the whole age held impossible was merely difficult, and who did it so well that her own contemporaries, watching with every prejudice of their time, could find no honest word for her but wise. They point to the long years of good government, to the great works that still stand, to the loyalty she drew from church and barons alike, and they ask, not unreasonably, what more could be asked of a ruler, save only that she had been born a man? We should remember, in weighing her, how little of her own voice has come down to us. Not a single letter survives, in which she speaks plainly of her own hopes or fears or reasons, no private words, no confession of what she felt, as she fought her husband or wrote her son out of the charters or came down at last from her tower. We have her deeds, recorded by others, and the dry formulas of her charters, and the judgments of men who watched her from the outside. The inner woman, the person behind the queen, is lost to us almost entirely, and we are left to reconstruct her, as we must reconstruct so many women of that age, from the shape of the hole she left in the record. The chronicler who knew that world best, the careful and fair-minded William of Tyre, came down firmly on the side of her gifts, praising her wisdom and her strength, and counting her among the able rulers of the Holy Land. And perhaps the disagreement itself is the truest monument to her, for we do not argue about the colourless and the forgettable. We argue about those who were large enough to cast a shadow, who did things great enough to be praised and blamed alike, who left a mark deep enough that people are still turning it over centuries later, trying to decide what to make of it. Forgettable rulers are not fought over by the historians. Melisende is, the truth, as it usually is, lies somewhere in the gathered weight of both views. And if we are honest, that is true of a great many of the rulers we are taught to admire without reservation. The kings and conquerors whose ambition we excuse as greatness because it happened to wear a crown and carry a sword. We forgive in men the very hunger for power that we are quick to call grasping in a woman. Melisende wanted to rule, and ruled, and held on, exactly as 100 celebrated kings have done, and she did it in a world that gave her every reason and every right to expect the throne, and then resented her for sitting on it. She was ambitious, and she was capable, and in her these were not two separate things, but one, the single fierce will of a woman who had been raised from childhood to rule, and who, having tasted rule and found that she could do it well, would not lightly give it up. Before we leave her there in the valley below the walls, let us hold the whole shape of her life in our minds one last time. For it has a symmetry to it that is almost too neat to be real, and yet is wholly true. She began as a girl written into a kingdom by a careful father who loved her, raised up to be a queen against the grain of her whole age. She was written out of that realm by the husband sent to share it with her. And she fought her way back to the very centre of power by patience and nerve and the loyalty of those who loved her. And then, grown old in that power, she did to her own son the very thing that had once been done to her, and was written out a second time, brought down by her own child as she had once been raised up by her own father. The woman who was wronged became, in her turn, the one who wronged. And yet even that did not finish her, for she came down from her tower and made herself necessary all over again, and ended her days honoured, surrounded by her sisters, laid to rest beside her mother in holy ground, a life that turned and turned upon itself, of rising and falling and rising once more, of a crown given and taken and half regained, lived out by a woman who was, through every turn of it, unmistakably and entirely herself. There is a lesson in it somewhere, though perhaps not a tidy one, about power and the holding of it, about how the things that are done to us shape the things we do to others, about the strange way that defeat and victory in a long life can come to look, from far enough off, almost like the same act. Two faces of the one stubborn refusal to be made small. She was given a throne against the grain of her whole age, and she spent her life fighting to keep it, against a husband, against a son, against the simple weight of a world that did not think a woman should hold such power. And keep it she largely did, in one form or another, to the very end. And now the hour has grown late, and it is time to let her go, and to let the holy city and its candlelit churches and its proud quarrelsome lords fade back into the long quiet of the past where they belong. Let the great walls dissolve, let the gold of the dome and the dark of the valley grow, dim and distant. Let the names slip gently from your mind, the kings and the counts, the sisters in their far-off courts, the queen in her tower, all of them sinking softly down into the deep well of time, where they have rested for so many hundreds of years, and where they will rest on long after this night is over. She has been gone now for the better part of 900 years. The queen in her tower, the builder of the great church, the daughter and wife and mother of kings, who was in the end more than any of these. More even than a queen, a ruler in the fullest sense that her hard world allowed. The city she loved has passed through 100 hands since hers let it go. The kingdom she held has crumbled away. But somewhere in the quiet valley below the eastern wall, she still lies beside her mother, the two of them keeping their silence together, and now and then, on a night like this one, someone remembers her and tells her story over again in the dark, and that is its own small kind of immortality. There is nothing left for you to do now, nothing to hold and nothing to follow, only the slow and easy drift down into sleep, with the old story settling quietly behind you like dust coming to rest in a room where a candle has just gone out. If these long journeys into vanished worlds are a comfort to you on the nights when sleep is slow to come, then you are always welcome to come back and find another one waiting, and to follow along so that the next one finds its way to you. But that is a thought for the morning, and the morning is a long way off. The city sleeps in your mind now, its golden dome gone dim, its candlelit churches emptied, its proud and quarrelsome lords laid down with all their schemes forgotten, the whole bright dangerous world of it sinking softly into the dark from which we called it up for a few hours tonight. The queen sleeps in her green valley. The kingdom sleeps in its long dissolution, and you may sleep too now, carried gently down by the same slow tide that has taken all of them, into the deep and dreamless quiet where the past keeps its peace. For now there is only the dark and the warmth of the bed, and the last of the story fading out like a far-off bell. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.